Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. In January of 2012, a police truck parked on a trail in Griffith Park in Los Angeles, California. A member of the canine unit opened the door, and a police dog named Indiana Bones jumped out. Indy quickly caught a scent and led his handler to a mound of dirt just off the path. Indy pawed the dirt and suddenly revealed the top of a plastic bag. The dog's handler reached into the dirt and pulled out the bag, and when she looked inside, she saw 2 dismembered human feet and a hand. Indy's discovery would launch an investigation that would lead 2 LA detectives into the most insane case they'd ever worked, a case that would involve everything from Mexican drug cartels to a Canadian cannibal. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button goes camping, wait for them to go to bed for the night, at which point light and then throw a Yon Shakaduma firework onto their tent. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Christmas Day 2011, 67-year-old Hervey Medellin turned off the oven in his apartment in Hollywood, California, opened up the oven door, and pulled out a casserole dish covered with foil. Hervey looked up at the clock and smiled, because his friend, who was coming over for a holiday visit, would be there any minute, and the food he was making had finished cooking at exactly the right time. He turned down the radio playing Christmas music in the kitchen and called out to his roommate, Gabriel Martinez, and told him lunch was almost ready. Gabriel had his eyes glued to his laptop, totally engrossed in whatever it was he was doing, and so he just gave Hervey a sort of grunt of acknowledgement. Hervey responded with an irritated sigh. Gabriel, who was 30 years younger than Hervey, had been spending so much time online lately that he barely connected with the world around him. Hervey realized it was very likely a generational thing, but he didn't understand why anyone would want to spend so much time just staring at a computer screen. But Hervey refused to be bothered by Gabriel today. It was Christmas, and Christmas was a time for joy, friends, and good food. Hervey set down the hot casserole dish on the table in the small dining area, and he looked around with satisfaction at all the Christmas decorations he had spent hours hanging up. Hervey's entire one-bedroom apartment now looked like it had been decorated by a professional interior designer. But perhaps the most impressive part of the decorations was not actually the Christmas stuff. It was the paintings that were hanging on the walls. These were not paintings that would be found in most small one-bedroom apartments. These were original works by famous artists. Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting Hervey's thoughts, and Hervey removed his oven mitts and went to open the door. And when he did, he saw his friend Amelia standing there, holding several wrapped presents. Hervey grinned and said Merry Christmas and gave Amelia a big hug. Then he led her inside and told her to put the presents down, because before they got to presents and to food, he had to show her something. Amelia put down the presents, said hello to Gabriel, and then Hervey took her hand and led her across the front room. Then Hervey pointed to a painting hanging on the wall, and he could hear Amelia gasp. She turned to Hervey almost in disbelief and asked if it was an original. Hervey smiled and nodded. He said the last time he'd gone down to Mexico, where he was originally from, he had acquired this painting, which was an original work of art by Diego Rivera, one of the most famous Mexican painters to have ever lived. After staring at this painting with his friend for several minutes, Hervey said it was time to go eat. He told Gabriel to put his computer away for a while and join them, and then the 3 of them headed to the table and dug into the casserole Hervey had prepared. While they ate, Hervey told Amelia more about his latest trip to Mexico and also about the travel plans he was making to destinations all over the world. Hervey said sometimes he still couldn't believe this was actually his real life. He'd worked so hard from the moment he came to the United States as a young man, with the hope that one day he'd be able to do whatever he wanted. And now he felt like he'd accomplished that. He was retired and filling his days with adventure and art. Hervey, Amelia, and Gabriel spent the day eating, talking, laughing, and exchanging gifts. For Hervey, who had spent most of his life far away from his family, this really felt like the perfect holiday. and other than maybe traveling, he couldn't imagine a better way to spend his time than eating delicious food and catching up with friends. By late afternoon, Amelia said unfortunately she had to go home, so Hervey walked her to the door. He gave her another big hug, wished her Merry Christmas again, and said he couldn't wait to get together with her in the new year. More than 3 weeks later, on the morning of Tuesday, January 17th, a dog walker named Lauren Kornberg left her house with her mother and 9 dogs. They headed toward their usual hiking path, which cut through an area called Bronson Canyon. Bronson Canyon is located inside of Griffith Park, which is basically LA's equivalent to New York's Central Park, but it sits high above the city. It was the perfect winter morning in Los Angeles, which meant it was a crisp 50 degrees and the Hollywood Hills were bathed in soft orange sunlight. So Lauren and her mom took the dogs up a side path that branched out from the main hiking trail, and once they were far enough away from other hikers, they let the dogs off leash. And as soon as that happened, the dogs instantly began playfully running around together, but one of them, a golden retriever, broke away from the pack and wandered over toward a bushy area next to a shallow ravine off the side of the path. And this golden retriever began digging in this one area of the brush. Lauren watched as the retriever pulled out a plastic bag from the brush and then began sniffing it. And as the dog began to sort of vigorously paw at this bag, a large round object suddenly rolled out of it and began tumbling down into the ravine. 2 other dogs from the group, a husky and a small terrier, ran down the ravine after this big round object. And Lauren's mom asked what had just rolled out of the bag. Lauren said she didn't know, but it sort of looked like a movie prop, which wouldn't actually be an unusual thing to find lying around, because there were Hollywood special effects and prop houses not too far from here, and many movies and TV shows were filmed in this area. Lauren's mom walked over toward the ravine to try to get a better look at this movie prop, but as she got close to the edge, she looked down and saw that the dogs were no longer playing. In fact, the terrier was backing away from this object with its hair up, like the dog was terrified. And so Lauren, she kind of leaned forward and looked as best as she could to see what this object was. And suddenly, when one of the dogs stepped out of the way, she had a clear line of sight onto this object. And when she saw what it was, she began backing away too. Because the object was no prop. It was a real severed human head. About an hour later, helicopters loudly hovered over the canyon and police blocked access to the entire area, as more than a dozen LAPD cruisers, CSI units, and news vans parked along the nearby scenic overlook. Detective Chuck Knowles and his partner, Detective Lisa Sanchez, walked up the trail and met with the uniformed officers who had cordoned off the area with police tape. By this point, crime scene investigators had retrieved the severed head from the ravine and brought it onto the trail. When Detective Sanchez walked over to them and saw the severed head, her stomach churned. She had investigated her fair share of murder cases, but this was the first time she dealt with any kind of dismemberment. As Sanchez began to study the head, one of the uniformed officers walked up to her and told her that the 2 women who actually found the head at first thought it was fake. They thought it was a movie prop. Detective Sanchez could understand why, because there was very little decomposition, and the head was so fresh and pristine that it looked like it had just been removed. From the looks of it, Sanchez believed the head belonged to a man who could be in his 60s, but that was about all she could guess about the victim at this point. So police began fanning out and searching the area, hoping to find some more clues. More helicopters and search units began to pour into the area, and the search expanded to a 7-acre radius. Searchers began entering backyards of the homes in the area, and some of these homes were really expensive houses that belonged to famous movie stars, so the police knew this case was going to draw even more media attention. Around 4:30 p.m., the sun began to set, and despite an exhaustive search of the area, no further human remains turned up. So the searchers left their equipment, kept the area cordoned off, and went home for the night. That evening, reports of the dismembered body found in Griffith Park were all over local news stations. And although violent crime in LA was far from rare, violent crime in this particular neighborhood in Bronson Canyon was almost unheard of. The people who lived in the neighborhood, who were willing to talk on camera, were shocked that something like this could happen just beyond their backyards. People who had been hiking and walking their dogs in Bronson Canyon for years told reporters they were now afraid to step foot on the hiking paths until the killer or killers were apprehended. The following day, LAPD returned to Bronson Canyon and performed a highly organized grid search, scouring the area where the head had turned up. The police were already feeling pressure from the media, city leaders, and local residents to find the people or person who had committed this horrific crime. But Detectives Knowles and Sanchez knew there was still so much physical area to cover and search, and they still had no idea who the victim even was. So this just didn't seem like a case they could just wrap up in a couple of days. And by late morning, the searchers had still found nothing new when a police truck pulled up and a dog handler stepped out with her cadaver dog, a German Shepherd named Indiana Bones, who was famous for being the first four-legged detective on LA County Coroner's team. After getting out of the car, Indy's handler began leading the dog up a nearby hill, and almost immediately as they began to walk, Indy pulled the handler in the direction of this nearby dirt mound. The handler walked over to the mound and, with a gloved hand, began pushing the dirt aside, revealing what looked like a shallow grave. And in this shallow grave was a plastic bag. The handler reached her hands down and carefully cupped them beneath the bag and gently pulled it out of the ground. Then she took a pair of scissors out of her pocket, cut the bag open, and looked inside. And inside, she saw a pair of human feet and a hand. The next morning, Detective Knowles and Sanchez sat at their computers, sifting through recent missing person reports. The victim's torso, or any more of his body, still had not been found. But the detectives hoped that the feet and hand that were found also belonged to their victim, and that with these new body parts, they might be able to connect their victim to somebody who went missing in the area. Just then, the sound of a fax machine broke their focus. Knowles stood up, tore the paper off the machine, and saw that the medical examiner had completed his examination on the severed hand, feet, and head. Knowles scanned the whole report and then read aloud the important parts to Sanchez. The medical examiner had confirmed that all those body parts belonged to the same victim. Also, they said that after the victim was dead, his killer carefully cut apart the man's body, right at the joints in a very precise manner. So whoever cut the body up seemed to really know what they were doing. But what was even more intriguing was that the body parts had been refrigerated before they were dumped, which explained why the head had looked so fresh when it was found. But this made it difficult for the medical examiner to pin down exactly when the victim was killed. However, because the parts were so fresh, the examiner was able to lift very clear fingerprints from the man's fingers. And when he ran those prints through a system, he got a hit. The dismembered man was Hervey Medellin. Knowles sat down at his computer and ran Hervey's name through every database he had access to. And he quickly learned that Hervey had been reported missing just a day before his head was found. The missing persons report had been filed by a man named Gabriel Martinez, who said he was Hervey's roommate. So Detective Knowles and Sanchez got into their car and began driving towards Hervey's apartment, which happened to be just 2 blocks away from the Hollywood police station. While they were in the car, Knowles and Sanchez discussed their game plan for when they talked to this roommate. And their plan was simple: reveal nothing. Although news of the grisly discovery was already all over town, that victim's identity had not yet been released by the media. Only the police knew that information. And so they wanted to feel out what Hervey's roommate knew and didn't know. He was not a suspect yet, but he was definitely a person of interest. The detectives parked at the curb and walked up to Hervey's building. It was this elegantly plain, narrow building constructed in the 1920s that felt totally vintage and old Hollywood. The detectives walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, to apartment 319, and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened and a dark-haired man in his 30s greeted the detectives. They introduced themselves and asked if he was Gabriel Martinez. Gabriel said yes, and then asked immediately if they had news about Hervey. Had they found him? Was he okay? The detectives exchanged a quick glance, and then Sanchez said they were still investigating Hervey's disappearance. And for now, they just needed to speak to Gabriel to try to help with that case. Gabriel suddenly went from being sort of hopeful to looking pretty concerned, but then told them he was glad to tell them anything they wanted, and he asked them to come inside. Once inside, they all sat down at the table in the small dining area. Detective Knowles asked Gabriel when he'd last seen Hervey, and Gabriel said not since shortly after Christmas, on December 27th. That's when Hervey had gone to Mexico, It was where he grew up and where he still had friends and family. Gabriel said that Hervey traveled internationally a lot, and sometimes he would go on these open-ended trips, so Gabriel was not always exactly sure when Hervey was going to come home again. But Hervey had been calling pretty regularly just to check in, and then suddenly the call stopped, so Gabriel started to get really worried and then eventually filed the missing person report. Detective Sanchez asked Gabriel if he had called or texted Hervey after Hervey stopped calling, just to see if maybe he was staying in Mexico longer. Gabriel said he hadn't, but he explained that Hervey had actually left his cell phone behind at the apartment because he didn't get service in Mexico. Now, Gabriel knew there were ways around that, but he said discussing technology with Hervey was usually a losing cause. Hervey just preferred to use a landline and an international calling card whenever he was in Mexico. Sanchez asked if there was a record of these calls from Hervey, and Gabriel said yes, and he grabbed his phone and showed the detectives the calls he'd received from Hervey in January. The detectives saw that these calls were from an international calling card number, which meant they didn't actually know who placed those calls, but it did corroborate what Gabriel had told them. The detectives would talk to Gabriel for a bit longer, but the whole time they stuck to their original plan. They didn't reveal anything about Hervey's murder. Back at the station, Detective Knowles and Sanchez went over what they had so far, and they agreed it was not very much. And what little they did have didn't quite add up. And it really had to do with this trip to Mexico they had just learned about. Did Hervey really go to Mexico and then get murdered and dismembered there? And then his body parts were shipped back to LA and dumped in LA? Or did Hervey come back from Mexico in one piece and then somehow get intercepted before he got home by somebody who then murdered, dismembered, and dumped him? Both these theories just seemed like they were missing something. Like, did Hervey really even go to Mexico? They didn't know. I mean, regardless of what Hervey's roommate Gabriel had told them, the detectives thought it actually made a whole lot more sense that somebody would have killed and dismembered Hervey right there in his own apartment and disposed of him in nearby Griffith Park, which certainly made Gabriel seem very suspicious. The following day, which is now 3 days after Hervey's head had been found, the detectives returned to Hervey's apartment, and this time they showed up with a search warrant, a team of police, and cadaver dogs. Once inside, they let the dogs loose, and the dogs began frantically sniffing around the floorboards, the furniture, and the corners of every room. Meanwhile, Gabriel sat at the table and watched in silence as the investigators practically tore up the tiny one-bedroom apartment. The search team rifled through drawers and closets, they confiscated computers and phones, and they photographed every item inside the apartment. But at the end of the search, they realized they had found absolutely nothing. There was no blood, no hidden torso, no bone saws or other dismemberment tools, and so this apartment just didn't appear to be the place where the murder or dismemberment or both took place. As the search team began to leave the apartment, Detectives Knowles and Sanchez sat down at the table with Gabriel. And Gabriel didn't look angry or raise his voice, but he wanted to know, what had changed since they spoke a day earlier that made the detectives feel like they could come into his and Hervey's home and tear it apart like this. Sanchez whispered something to Knowles, and then she finally broke the news to Gabriel. Those body parts that were found in the canyon that were all over the news belonged to Hervey. Hervey was deceased, and so now Hervey's death was being investigated as a homicide. Immediately, all the color drained from Gabriel's face. He said he couldn't believe it. This didn't seem real. Now, the detectives understood how upsetting this was for Gabriel, but they needed more information. So they pressed Gabriel for more details about Hervey's trip to Mexico. And so, for the next half hour, Gabriel, despite being in shock, was cooperative and answered every question and tried to give detectives any information at all that could be useful. Later that day, the two detectives returned to the station and went into an evidence room where everything collected from Hervey's apartment was laid out on a table. One of the evidence technicians in the room told the detectives that he happened to look at the photos taken of the apartment, and some of the victims' artwork hung on the walls was worth a ton of money. The Diego Rivera painting alone was likely worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, this struck the detectives as being really odd. According to the information Gabriel had provided, and based on what the detectives had learned from their databases, Hervey was a retiree, living on a small pension in a small one-bedroom apartment. So how was he also a serious art collector able to acquire paintings that were potentially worth a small fortune? The following day, so now 4 days after Hervey's head was discovered, a call came through to Knowles' desk. The man on the other end introduced himself as a retired LAPD narcotics detective, and this retired detective said he'd been reading the newspaper that morning and happened to see that the dismembered victim from Griffith Park had been identified. And when he saw the name, Hervey Medellin, it immediately rang a bell. He said back in the early 1990s, when he was investigating a Mexican drug cartel, Hervey's name had come up in the investigation. And in fact, he had interviewed Hervey a couple of times. Knowles kept listening, but right away his mind began to race. A connection to Mexican cartels and drug trafficking could maybe explain how Hervey had enough cash to buy those famous paintings. The retired detective explained that Hervey had worked as a ticket taker for Mexicana Airlines. At that time, that airline was believed to have been used for drug smuggling. And Hervey had become a kind of personal concierge for the wives and girlfriends of drug cartel members. When these women would visit LA, Hervey would book their hotel rooms, arrange shopping trips, and give them dining recommendations. Now, none of that was illegal, so the narcotics detective had no reason to pursue Hervey. He ultimately just kind of became a minor character in a much bigger investigation. But now that this former detective found out that Hervey had turned up dead and dismembered, he wondered if maybe Hervey's connection to the drug cartels had gone much deeper than he realized. As Knowles listened, he was having the same type of thoughts. Was Hervey a drug mule? Were those paintings a form of payment from the cartels? Did Hervey fail to repay a debt, and did the cartel brutally murder him for it? After all, some Mexican cartels were known to behead and dismember some of their victims. Knowles thanked the retired detective for reaching out to him. He hung up and passed this new information along to his partner Sanchez. The detectives now realized they could be in over their heads. Poking the hornet's nest with a Mexican drug cartel is the kind of thing that gets people killed, even cops. Over the next week, Knowles and Sanchez started to pursue this new lead, but they quickly discovered that a potential run-in with a violent Mexican drug cartel was actually not the biggest issue they were facing. Instead, the big issue that kept setting them back was just old-fashioned bureaucracy. Getting Mexican law enforcement agencies to cooperate in any investigation was never really easy, but when the investigation involved the cartels, it seemed almost impossible. Mexican authorities weren't eager to anger the cartels or possibly jeopardize their own investigations into the drug trade just to assist LA cops on a homicide case. And when Knowles and Sanchez turned to federal law enforcement agencies in the United States, they ran into similar problems. The DEA and the FBI were running multiple investigations involving the cartels, and they could not put those at risk just because Hervey had been interviewed by a narcotics cop over 20 years ago. But the FBI did at least tell Knowles and Sanchez that they would dig into Hervey's financial records to see if he had a clear connection to the cartels before he was killed. In the meantime, the feds told the LA detectives to go ahead and stay away from the cartel stuff and just let them handle that. They should just focus on leads that were in the United States. Now, Knowles and Sanchez understood why the feds reacted that way, but they still felt like a huge lead, i.e. going after the cartels, had just been yanked out from under them. On top of that, the FBI had no reason to expedite finding these financial records because this was not their case, so there was no telling how long it would actually take the feds to provide them with any information. Feeling frustrated and a bit lost on what to do next, Knowles and Sanchez turned their focus back to the victim. The detectives reached out to Hervey's LA friends to learn more about who Hervey was. And the picture that began to emerge of Hervey was of a warm, friendly guy who had moved to LA from Mexico as a young man, who had worked hard and was now enjoying his retirement and living the American dream that he had always believed in. Now, Knowles and Sanchez didn't think any of this information really helped their case, and none of it seemed to make Hervey look like a guy who had deep ties to the drug trafficking world. The detectives would still need to hear back from the FBI, but if Hervey had been working with a cartel, he'd managed to keep it pretty secret. So the detectives just kept pushing forward, talking to everyone they could who knew Hervey. And finally, just when they felt like they were running out of people to interview, the detectives did learn something very interesting. Hervey's roommate, Gabriel, was not just his roommate. Gabriel was Hervey's boyfriend. Now, Gabriel had not told the detectives this, and they couldn't believe that he had kept this a secret across the 2 interviews they had done with him. Having an intimate relationship with the victim immediately put Gabriel at the top of the suspect list, and the fact that he had lied about the relationship made him look even more suspicious. So, Knowles and Sanchez called Gabriel into the station for another interview. But when they confronted him, instead of him getting defensive or trying to deny it, Gabriel readily admitted that he and Hervey were indeed in a relationship. He told the detectives he was just a very private person and felt uncomfortable sharing those kinds of details. Sanchez and Knowles did not believe Gabriel, and they told him that because he had hid this information, they felt like he could be hiding something else. But Gabriel insisted he wasn't hiding anything. And then without any further prompting, he opened up about his and Hervey's relationship. Gabriel told them all about how he and Hervey had met, how at first they were good friends, and then they fell in love and moved in together. And after several minutes of this, when the detectives were finally able to steer the conversation back to the weeks leading up to the murder, Gabriel's story about Hervey's trip to Mexico and the phone calls he got didn't change at all. By the end of the interview, Knowles and Sanchez really didn't know what to think. Gabriel had clearly held back information from them about the relationship with Hervey, but when confronted, he told them all about it and then hadn't changed or embellished his story at all from that point forward. And also, they had already searched the apartment and there was no evidence that connected Gabriel to the crime. Not long after this meeting, things only seemed to get worse for the 2 detectives. The FBI came back to them and told them that after doing some digging, they found that Hervey's financial records did not show any connection to any drug cartels, or any other known criminals for that matter. Now, they still couldn't completely rule out the cartel's involvement in this murder, but for now at least, this lead felt like a dead end. By mid-April, so 3 months after Hervey's head had been found, the LAPD finally released Hervey's remains to his family so they could have a proper funeral. Knowles and Sanchez couldn't help but feel like they had let Hervey and his family down. They were no closer to finding the killer or killers than they had been on day 1 of the investigation. And in the weeks following the funeral, Knowles and Sanchez started to get assigned new cases that required immediate action. Hervey's murder was slowly becoming a cold case. Until one day in June, so now 5 months after Hervey's head had been found, Detective Knowles' phone rang, and he had one of the most bizarre conversations he'd had in all his time working in homicide. The caller introduced himself as an investigator with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. For a second, Knowles thought somebody might be prank calling him, because it was not every day an LA detective gets a call from a Canadian Mountie. But the Mountie quickly told Knowles that he'd been made aware of the case from back in January with the severed head and limbs. And the Mountie said they had actually just had a very similar case up in Quebec. A video had been uploaded to the internet that showed this naked man tied to a bed and another individual, dressed all in black, repeatedly stabbing him with an ice pick. And then once the man was dead, the killer dismembered the body before sexually abusing the body and cannibalizing some parts of it. And as if that wasn't brutal enough, the killer then sent other parts of the body to members of Canadian Parliament and several different elementary schools. Detective Knowles just sat there on the phone in silence. I mean, this was a totally brutal and horrible story, but he couldn't see any real connection to Hervey's murder, aside from both victims having been dismembered. But the Mountie continued and said they had actually already arrested this internet killer. And this man, who was a Canadian citizen named Luca Magnotta, was obsessed with Hollywood. He had recently lived in Los Angeles, not far from where Hervey lived, where he acted in porn movies and worked as a male escort before going back to Canada. But the big thing, the real reason the Mountie had called Knowles in the first place, was that while Luca was living in Los Angeles, he kept a blog in which he wrote about his exploits. And one of the things he wrote about was the dismembered body found in Bronson Canyon, Hervey's body. After the call with the Mountie, Knowles quickly met with Sanchez, and the detectives decided the first thing they needed to do was figure out exactly when Luca had been in the United States to see if maybe he could have actually crossed paths with Hervey in late December or January, the time they believed Hervey was killed. They reached out to the agencies in the US and Canada that maintain customs data, and they were able to find out when Luca actually crossed the border into the US and when he went back into Canada. Then they dug into Hervey's customs data to try to nail down the exact time he traveled to Mexico and if and when he came back to the States, in order to see if he and Luca had been in LA at the same time. But while they were looking into this, they discovered something that totally shocked them and made them rethink everything about this investigation. They came to realize that the reason the case had stalled out was because they had been operating under a false assumption the whole time. And after making this huge discovery, Knowles and Sanchez believed they had finally cracked the case. Based on all the evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Hervey Medellin. At around 3 a.m. on December 27, 2011, the killer crept through Hervey's apartment to the bedroom. The door was cracked open, and the killer looked in and saw Hervey sleeping inside. The killer threw the door open, rushed the bed, and jumped on top of him. Hervey immediately woke up and began yelling as the killer tried to cup their hands over Hervey's mouth to muffle his screams. Hervey kept fighting back, but the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and began to squeeze. Hervey continued to yell, so the killer squeezed harder and harder, and after about 5 minutes of this, Hervey stopped struggling. His face was blue and his eyes were empty. He was dead. The killer remained in Hervey's apartment, and a bit later that morning, they opened up Gabriel's computer and did a search. They pulled up an article titled "Butchering the Human Carcass for Consumption." This article provided detailed instructions on how to dismember a human body for the purpose of cooking and consuming it. Once the killer felt like they had a clear understanding of what to do, they went back to Hervey's bedroom and used a saw they had recently purchased to separate Hervey's head and limbs from his body. The killer then refrigerated those body parts for 3 weeks, but for reasons no one fully understands, the killer never actually consumed any of it. There was no cannibalism, despite clearly there being some level of interest based on that search that was done on Gabriel's computer on the night of the murder. And so 3 weeks after the murder, the killer walked through Bronson Canyon in the dark with Hervey's body parts and dug shallow graves at various spots and buried them. And soon after that, with Hervey now officially out of the picture, the killer was able to transfer all the money from Hervey's personal bank account into the joint bank account they had opened after they had moved in together. Gabriel Martinez murdered his boyfriend Hervey in the apartment they shared. It turned out that before Christmas of 2011, Gabriel and Hervey's relationship had started to completely fall apart. In fact, things had gotten so bad that Hervey told Gabriel he wanted to end things, and he said Gabriel should start looking for another place to live. Gabriel knew he would not be able to afford a Los Angeles apartment or lead the life he'd grown accustomed to on his own because he didn't have a steady income. He had become financially dependent on Hervey, and so, in his desperation, he had decided to kill Hervey and steal his money. On Christmas Day, when Hervey's friend Amelia came over, Gabriel sat on the couch with his laptop, Googling what tools to use to cut up a human body. Being Hervey's significant other and failing to disclose their relationship to police had made Gabriel a leading suspect early on, but police had found no clear evidence pointing to Gabriel or anyone else, so the case had gone cold. But it was the customs data that detectives obtained while following the lead on the Canadian internet killer, Luca Magnotta, that helped lead them back to Gabriel. Customs data showed that Luca had been in Canada at the time Hervey went missing, which ruled Luca out as the killer. But more importantly, this customs data made it clear that Hervey had never actually traveled or even booked a flight to Mexico at any time in late December or January. Gabriel had crafted this intricate lie about Hervey's trip, even providing phone records showing all the times Hervey had called him from Mexico. But once investigators knew Gabriel was lying, they dug deeper into his phone records and discovered the calls had actually come from Hervey's friend, who was calling Gabriel from Mexico, but they were doing so to find out why they had suddenly stopped hearing from Hervey. At this point, the detectives were sure Gabriel was the killer. But the final piece of evidence they would need to convince the district attorney would not be discovered until 2014, over 2 years after the murder. At that time, a city worker was digging in the ground not too far from where Hervey's head had been discovered, and he found a plastic bag containing pieces of decaying human flesh. A DNA sample of this flesh matched Hervey's DNA, but it was actually the bag itself that sealed Hervey's case, because this was a very specific type of bag, one that was used to protect and transport expensive paintings, and it matched those same types of bags that had been found in Hervey and Gabriel's apartment. Los Angeles detectives tracked Gabriel down in San Antonio, Texas, where he had married a wealthy woman who was supporting him, and with the help of local police, they arrested him. Gabriel was eventually found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts, or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So, that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. On a summer morning in 2001, a woman in Alabama woke up in a cold sweat, like she just had a nightmare. But the woman knew what she saw while she was sleeping was not a bad dream. It was real. So she grabbed her phone and made a frantic call. Later that morning, police arrived at an old wooden house on the outskirts of a small rural town. They stepped inside, and they were absolutely shocked, because the woman really had led them to a horrifying crime scene. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the Follow Button's medicine cabinet and replace everything with laxatives. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 19, 2001, 44-year-old Debbie Triplett and her husband Billy were stocking shelves in the small country grocery store that they owned in Clay County, Alabama. Billy and Debbie had run the store together for almost 20 years, and they had stocking shelves down to a science. They barely even had to look while they were doing it. So today, like most days, they spent the time talking and joking with each other. For as long as they'd been doing this, Billy and Debbie never got bored working at the store together. In fact, they didn't understand how anyone would get bored working with the person they loved, because the two of them had been pretty much inseparable from the moment they met back in 1982. At the time, Billy, who was 8 years older than Debbie, already owned the grocery store, but he'd been having trouble running it by himself. So, when Debbie came in looking for a job, he'd hired her right away. And it didn't take long for them to discover that they had a lot in common. They were both single parents, they loved living in a small town where they knew their kids would be safe, and they could talk to each other for hours without ever running out of things to say. Billy and Debbie's relationship had quickly gone from boss and employee to boyfriend and girlfriend to husband and wife. And their children from their previous marriages ended up loving each other as much as Debbie and Billy did. So they had all quickly formed this really tight-knit blended family. Now, almost 20 years later, the kids had grown up and moved out, but they all lived close by, so the blended family was still together. In the store, Billy kept stocking the shelves, but Debbie glanced up at the clock hanging over the counter and said that maybe they should call it a day. Billy was supposed to meet up with their son Randy, and if he wanted to do that and still get home in time for the first pitch of the Atlanta Braves baseball game, he needed to head out now. Everyone who knew Billy assumed he must have been born in an Atlanta Braves baseball cap, because he wore one pretty much every day. They also knew he absolutely hated to miss a Braves game. But today, Billy wasn't sure if he should just take off, because he really didn't like the idea of leaving Debbie alone at the store. The couple didn't like to talk about it, but on a night about 3 months earlier, when Billy was closing the store on his own, 3 men wearing ski masks had burst in, duct taped Billy's mouth, shoved him into the walk-in cooler, and then robbed the cash register. By the time Billy had gotten out of the cooler, the men were long gone, but all he could think was, thank God Debbie was not here. Debbie could see the look of concern on her husband's face, and she told him not to worry. Those robbers had not been seen again. Besides, their daughter Michelle was coming by to keep her company for a while, and then she'd close the store because she had dinner plans. Billy thought about it for a second, and then said she was right. So he gave Debbie a kiss and said he would see her at home when she was finished with dinner. Later that afternoon, Debbie's daughter Michelle walked into the store, and the 2 women immediately started talking like they were best friends. Debbie had Michelle and her brother Michael with her first husband, but they had treated Billy as their dad since they were young, just like Billy's son, Randy, saw Debbie as his mother. Still, Debbie shared a bond with Michelle that was special, even among the kids. They saw or talked to each other every single day. Time always flew by when it was just the 2 of them, and today at the store was no different. They talked about everything that was going on in their lives, and when Michelle finally caught a glimpse of the clock, she said she needed to head out. But Michelle hesitated, because like Billy, she wanted to make sure her mom would be okay on her own. Despite Billy and Debbie rarely talking about the robbery, Michelle and her brothers knew all about it, and they worried about their parents constantly. Debbie said she'd be fine. She could take care of herself, and after all, she'd been closing up the store for 2 decades. Michelle knew better than to argue with her mother, so she told her that she loved her, and then she left. Debbie worked a while longer on her own, then started closing the store. She emptied the cash register and put all the money into a metal lockbox. She turned off the lights and walked outside with the box under her arm. Then she locked the door behind her and climbed into her minivan that was parked out front. And as she drove down the secluded country road outside the store, Debbie felt excited about her dinner plans, and she hoped the Braves were winning so Billy would be in a really good mood when she got home. Early the next morning, Debbie's daughter Michelle sat straight up in bed. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and she could feel her heart pounding. She was terrified, like she'd just had a nightmare. But Michelle knew the fear she was feeling was not because of a dream. Michelle believed that her connection to her mother was something way stronger than a typical bond between mom and daughter. It was almost psychic, like they shared a sixth sense or something. It was like they always knew when the other one was upset or in trouble. And right now, Michelle knew something really bad had happened. She reached over and grabbed her phone off the bedside table and called her mom. When she didn't get an answer, she immediately hung up and called her brother Michael. The second she heard Michael's voice, she said something was wrong with their mom, and since he could get there faster, he needed to get over to her house right away. Michael never doubted the intense connection between his sister and his mom, so he said he was on his way out the door. Michelle hung up the phone, got dressed, and ran out to her car. She sped down the road that cut through most of the small rural towns in Clay County, and then a few minutes later, she turned onto a dirt road that led to her parents' house. As Michelle pulled up in front of the house, she saw her brother pacing back and forth in the yard, and she heard the sound of a police siren in the distance. Michelle got out and ran straight to Michael. He wrapped his arms around her tight and just said, "Sister, they're gone." Early that afternoon, Agent Todd Wheels of the Alabama Bureau of Investigation drove down a 2-lane road lined by acres of trees on one side and a river on the other. This landscape, that would cause most people to feel like they were stranded in the middle of nowhere, felt completely familiar to Agent Wheels. He'd grown up in Clay County, which was not too far from here, so for him, it was like he was coming home. That morning, a call had come into the Bureau from the Clay County Sheriff's Department. County deputies had responded to a 911 call at Debbie and Billy Triplett's house. The second they walked inside, they knew the Sheriff's Department did not have the resources to handle this case, so they had asked the state police for help. Agent Wheels turned onto a dirt road and slowed down as he approached an old white wooden house that sat on a large piece of land that backed up to dense green woods. County police officers had already set up crime scene tape around the perimeter of the house, and a couple of deputies stood out front with a man and a woman in their 20s. Wheels parked his car and looked out at the man and woman, and he felt his heart sink, because he had known both of them since they were little kids. Wheels had grown up in a town not too far from where Michelle, Michael, and their brother Randy lived with their parents, and they had always attended rival schools. So Wheels had seen the entire family at football games, academic competitions, parties, and church functions for most of his life. Wheels took a breath, stepped out of the car, and walked over to Michelle and Michael. He said he hated seeing them under these circumstances, but he needed to look inside the house, and then he would come back out to talk to them. They both nodded like they barely heard what he said, and Wheels ducked under the crime scene tape, put on a pair of gloves, and headed inside. But before he could even take a few steps, he saw Debbie's body lying on the floor. She was surrounded by a huge pool of dried blood, and there was blood spatter all over the walls. Wheels had worked homicides in much bigger places than this, cities that had reputations for violence, but this attack on Debbie looked as gruesome as anything he'd ever seen. He crouched down and found Debbie's purse beside her. He noticed bloodstains inside the purse, and it looked like somebody had rifled through it. Wheels thought this could be a sign that this was a robbery gone bad, that somebody had broken in, and then when they heard Debbie come home, they rushed over and killed her as soon as she walked inside. Wheels left Debbie's body and walked down a short hallway into the family room. And there, on the couch, he saw Billy's body, covered in blood as well. This was the first reported double homicide in Clay County in over 40 years, and Agent Wheels could not believe he knew the victims. Wheels approached Billy's body when something on the wall right above caught his attention. When he'd first walked into the room, he thought it was blood spatter, but now he could see it was red lipstick. And someone had used this lipstick to leave a message for the police. It was a single word: narc. At 4 p.m., several hours after Agent Wheels arrived at the scene, he was back in the family room, staring at the lipstick on the wall for what felt like the 10th time that day. But now he was with members of a state forensics team that had just arrived. Wheels had gone outside earlier to check on Michelle and Michael, and to ask them if they knew what their parents had been doing the night before. Michael said that he and his wife had met his mom for dinner after she closed the store, and then as far as he knew, she went straight home. And both siblings assumed that their dad had watched the Braves game and then just stayed in for the night. Back in the family room, Wheels and the forensics technicians could still not get over the violence that was inflicted on Billy. This was even more brutal than the attack on Debbie. This kind of rage made Wheels think that the attack must have been carried out by someone who had a close emotional connection to Billy, or by someone who was out for revenge. And the word narc also had strong connections to the drug world. As Wheels stood there, fixated on the wall, he heard people shouting outside, and he snapped out of his trance. He immediately turned around and ran out of the house. In the front yard, Wheels saw a man physically struggling with two deputies and yelling that he and his siblings needed to get inside. Their parents were in there. Wheels recognized this man as Billy's son, Randy. Back when they were teenagers, Wheels and Randy had been on their respective high school's Scholar Bowl teams, and they had developed a friendly rivalry with each other at academic competitions. Wheels darted across the yard, joined the deputies, and in his calm southern accent, told Randy he needed to back off. Randy stopped struggling and looked up at Wheels, and this look came across Randy's face like he didn't understand why this man was standing there. Randy squinted a little and then just said, "Tom?" Agent Wheels said he wished this was not how they were seeing each other for the first time in a while, but he needed Randy to calm down and step back. Randy took a deep breath and apologized to the deputies. He told Wheels he had lashed out because he was mad at himself. He'd missed the messages he'd gotten from Michelle and Michael, and he felt like he'd let his brother and sister down by not getting here earlier. Wheels said he understood. While the two men talked, Wheels heard someone shouting his name from across the yard. He looked over and saw a forensics tech standing by a minivan that was parked near the side of the house. Wheels told Randy to go wait with his siblings, and then he walked over to the van. The front passenger door was open, and the forensics tech said the van had been unlocked. He pointed to the passenger seat, and Wheels saw the keys to the van sitting there. But Wheels also saw something in the passenger side floorboard. It was an open, empty metal box turned over on its side. Wheels called out to the deputies to bring Randy, Michelle, and Michael over to the van, and when the three siblings got there, they didn't look surprised at all. Wheels asked them what the container was, and they told him it was the money box their parents put the cash from the register in every night when they closed the store. And their mom had a terrible habit of just leaving the box in her van when she got home. This clue definitely played into the idea that these murders were connected to a robbery, but maybe it was not a home robbery that got interrupted. Wheels asked the siblings if it was common knowledge around town that their parents put their money from the store in the box every night. Would someone have known Debbie had all that cash and maybe followed her home? The kids looked at each other for a moment, like they were talking without saying anything, and then Michelle said a few months earlier their parents' store had been robbed by some men at closing time, so these men might have known exactly where their parents put the money from the cash register. Wheels got a few more details about that robbery, and then he told the siblings they could go. They should have some time to grieve together in private. Wheels spent the whole day at the house, and it was dark outside when he met the members of the forensics team to get a final report for the day. They believed that Debbie and Billy had been killed the previous night. The team had also pulled blood samples from both bodies and from the rooms where they were found, and they had done a thorough sweep of the minivan. But the van appeared to have been completely wiped down before any investigators had even touched it. However, investigators were confident that with all the blood and all the fingerprints found inside the house, that they would still likely be able to get the print and DNA samples that belonged to the killer. At the time, DNA testing in Alabama was still a relatively slow process. It could take several weeks or even months to get results. Still, Wheels had a lot of faith in DNA testing, so he was willing to be patient. In the meantime, he had two distinct theories about the case. This was either a robbery gone bad, or Billy really had ratted somebody out to the authorities, likely over something having to do with the drug trade. On June 21st, so the day after the bodies had been discovered, Agent Wheels followed Michelle into her house, which was just a few miles away from her parents, and they sat down together in the small front room. Wheels spoke in the calm voice he almost always used on the job. He said he didn't want to imply that anybody was lying, but he had met with county police, and they had no record whatsoever of a robbery that took place at Billy and Debbie's store. So Wheels wanted to know what Michelle and her brothers had been talking about. Michelle sighed. She and her brothers were telling the truth. There had been a robbery. Their parents had just never reported it. Wheels looked totally confused by this. Why on earth would they keep something like that to themselves? Michelle laughed a little and said it was stupid, but her dad had been illegally selling wine and beer, and even a little moonshine out of the back of the store. And he thought if he reported the robbery, the cops would find out about it. In 2001, Clay County, Alabama was what's known as a dry county. This meant it was illegal to sell any alcohol within county limits. When Agent Wheels heard this news about Billy, he laughed just like Michelle had. This was the kind of thing he'd heard about his whole life growing up in Clay County. He knew Billy wasn't running some major bootlegging operation like people had done back during Prohibition. Instead, he was most likely just selling booze to his friends and to some people from town. But at the same time, Wheels could not shake the image of the word narc written on the wall above Billy's body. So he told Michelle he was not worried about Billy selling alcohol to his friends, but he needed to know if Billy was selling anything else illegal. Was Billy mixed up in the local drug trade? This question absolutely floored Michelle. She said there was no way her dad was dealing drugs. Wheels listened, and he didn't say anything, but he agreed with her. And not just because he had known Billy and the family. Wheels was familiar with the growing methamphetamine problem in the area, and he knew from working with colleagues in the state narcotics unit that a lot of the drugs were coming in from out of state. and that Billy did not fit the profile of most local meth dealers and users, who were often younger guys who didn't have steady jobs. So Wheels stood up and told Michelle that was all he needed for now. He said he'd check in with her as often as he could. But before he made it to the door, Michelle told him to wait. Wheels turned and walked back toward her. Michelle said again there was no way her dad was mixed up with drugs, but she did know somebody who was. It was a guy named Leonard Southers, and he happened to be one of Billy and Debbie's closest neighbors. Later that day, so still just one day after the discovery of the bodies, Agent Wheels pulled up to a house over a mile away from Billy and Debbie's. Michelle had been right. Everything was so isolated and spread out around here that this was definitely one of the closest homes to her parents. Wheels stepped out of his car, and he saw the lawn was completely overgrown and there were tools and a bunch of other stuff piled up all around. He took a few steps towards the house, and the screen door flew open. A skinny man in baggy jeans and a t-shirt rushed outside, demanding to know who Wheels was and what he was doing here. Wheels said everything was okay, and then asked the man if he was Leonard. The man nodded and said, "Who's asking?" Wheels introduced himself and said he was with the state police, but Leonard was not in any trouble. In fact, he needed Leonard's help. Wheels took a few more steps towards Leonard, and as he did, he could see track marks on both of his arms, clearly from injecting drugs. And the way Leonard fidgeted and picked at his skin made Wheels think he likely was a meth addict. Looking at Leonard, Wheels mostly just felt pity. This man obviously needed help, but that's not why Wheels was here right now. All of a sudden, Leonard raised both hands into the air to show he was not carrying a weapon, and then he moved towards Wheels. He leaned in really close and then pointed to the trees surrounding his house, and in a hushed voice, he asked if Wheels could see the men up there. Wheels turned and looked up at the trees, and as he did, Leonard started laughing. He said the men were in camouflage, so they were almost invisible, but he knew they were there. And he knew they were men like Wheels, agents that the government sent to watch him all the time. As calm as Wheels was, and as genuinely sympathetic as he tried to be whenever he was working a case, he knew he could change his personality on a dime when he needed to. It was like there was a switch in his head, and in that moment, Wheels flipped the switch. He stood up to his full height, raised his voice, and said Leonard was absolutely right. There were agents hiding in the trees, and if Leonard didn't tell him everything he knew about the deaths of Billy and Debbie Triplett, these agents in the trees would swarm. They would take Leonard away, and he would no longer be a free man. Leonard suddenly looked scared, but he quickly said he did want to help. He had heard Billy and Debbie got killed, and he was sad about it. They were nice people, both of them. Wheels flipped the switch again, and his calm voice came back. He told Leonard if he wanted to help, he needed to tell the truth and admit if he had gone over to Billy and Debbie's house to rob them, maybe for drug money. Leonard shook his head. He would never steal from them or try to hurt them. Wheels spoke with Leonard a while longer in the front yard, and by the time he left, he had a primary suspect. Leonard was a drug addict, and he was extremely paranoid. There was even a chance Leonard had convinced himself that his neighbor Billy was going to turn him in to the police for buying and using drugs, which in Leonard's mind would make Billy a narc. In the days following the murders, Agent Wheels had his team dig into Leonard's background and his history of drug use. Still, Wheels did not want to overlook anything, especially if it was because of a personal bias. He did not believe that Billy or Debbie had any connection to the local drug trade, but he needed to make sure. He asked for help from the state narcotics unit, and they said they would search their records to see if Billy or Debbie ever appeared as suspects or informants, or if any agents knew anything about them. In the meantime, Wheels was still waiting on the results of the DNA tests from the blood samples taken at the crime scene. But he did get an update on the fingerprints found throughout the house. At this point, all of the prints that had been pulled matched Billy, Debbie, and their kids, who had provided prints to the county police. So investigators figured the killer must have worn gloves, which probably meant they would not find any useful prints on the cash box either. This was not surprising, but Wheels still got frustrated. The investigation was in its early days, but he had hoped he might get lucky with the fingerprints and find a clear piece of evidence that pointed to the killer. Wheels always felt a real responsibility when investigating a murder to try to bring the killer to justice as quickly as possible, but he knew this case was something different. He had never worked a homicide where he actually knew the victims and their family, and so every day that he didn't find the killer made him feel like he was letting Michelle, Michael, and Randy down. About a week after the murders, Wheels got word from the narcotics unit that they didn't find anything on Billy or Debbie. It seemed pretty clear they had no connection to illegal drugs. In addition to that, because Billy and Debbie never filed a report about that store robbery, there were no leads on the men who had committed that crime. So, Wheels was basically where he'd been a week earlier, with the drug addict Leonard as his primary suspect. Still, Leonard being an addict and being paranoid about men in the trees did not automatically make him a killer. Wheels had to find something concrete to tie him to the murders. And about 1 week later, Wheels was going back over his notes when he got a phone call. And as soon as he heard the caller's nervous, shaky voice, he knew it was Leonard. And Leonard said that Wheels needed to come to his house right away because he had found blood on his money. Not long after this call, Agent Wheels found himself back in Leonard's front yard, not really knowing what to expect or what Leonard finding blood on his money even meant. Leonard stepped outside, walked over to Wheels, and showed him a stack of $1 and $5 bills he had in a shoebox. Wheels put on his gloves and picked up a few of the bills, and this didn't look like regular cash. The bills were faded, and there were these weird white spots on them, almost like bleach or something. And in that moment, Wheels understood what was going on. And he just stood there dumbfounded for a second, because he realized someone had put all of this money in a washing machine. They had literally tried to launder the money. This did seem like something Leonard might try, not understanding that money laundering was actually a complex illegal financial process that had nothing to do with detergent or bleach. But as ridiculous as all of this seemed to Wheels, a couple of things about these bills did look like major clues. Leonard's money, even after the laundering process, was grouped together in 1s and 5s, like it would be in a cash register. In addition to that, Leonard had not been using some kind of code or metaphor when he said he found blood on his money, because even though these bills were faded, Wheels saw several brownish red spots that he believed were bloodstains. To Wheels, this looked like it had to be the money stolen from the cash box that Debbie brought home from the store, and he assumed the blood on the bills either belonged to Debbie or the killer. Leonard must have sensed what Wheels was thinking because he got really jittery and blurted out that this was not his money. He had gotten it from another drug addict that he knew. Agent Wheels chose not to flip the switch in his demeanor. He stayed totally calm and said to Leonard, "Boy, that sounds like a pretty convenient excuse." But Leonard swore he was telling the truth, and he even told Wheels the name of this other drug addict. Wheels said he'd look into it, but he told Leonard he better not leave town. Wheels confiscated Leonard's cash, bagged it as evidence, and brought it to the county sheriff's station. Over the next few days, Wheels and his team dug into the background of this other drug addict that Leonard had mentioned, and then Wheels brought them in for an interview. At first, when Wheels asked about the night of the murders, he felt like he'd been right about Leonard lying. This interview was not going anywhere. But Wheels shifted his focus, and the interview suddenly took a complete turn. Because when Wheels brought up the money with the blood on it, this drug addict shouted, "That money you got from Leonard? That's my goddamn money!" Wheels just sat there. He couldn't even think of what to say next. He had dealt with a lot of different types of criminals over his career, but he had never heard a suspect just shout out something so potentially damning before. After the interview was over, Wheels let the drug addict go, but he quickly secured a search warrant for the addict's house, and he had the addict's car impounded. And when forensics experts searched the car, they found a faded bloody fingerprint on the driver's side door handle. The sample was sent off to the state lab for testing, and this time the lab expedited the test. So on July 26th, a little over a month after the murders, Agent Wheels got back those test results, along with the results from the initial DNA samples taken from the house. And Wheels knew he had found Billy and Debbie's killer. Based on DNA testing, interviews, and evidence found throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what state police believe happened to Billy and Debbie Triplett on June 19, 2001. That night, the killer quietly walked into Billy and Debbie's kitchen. They could hear the Braves game coming from the TV in the family room. The killer opened a drawer and pulled out a sharp knife. They carefully slid the knife into their back pocket and then walked into the family room. Billy sat up on the couch, and the killer immediately started shouting at him. Billy shouted back and was about to get off the couch, but the killer ran across the room and leapt on top of him. They struggled, but the killer pinned Billy down and without even looking, grabbed something heavy off the coffee table and started wildly slamming it into the side of Billy's head. Blood sprayed on the walls and all over the couch as Billy stopped moving. The killer got up, drew the knife from their pocket, grabbed Billy, and slit his throat. But the killer didn't stop. They kept digging the knife deeper into Billy's neck until they had almost decapitated him. Finally, the killer stepped back, walked away, and went to the kitchen. They washed the knife off, rinsed their hands and face, and set out some cleaning supplies. Then they picked the knife back up, went to the family room, sat down, and waited while the baseball game kept playing on TV. At 10 p.m., a few hours after the killer had arrived at the house, they heard a car pull up outside. They quickly turned off the TV and ran toward the front of the house, carrying the knife and the blunt object they'd attacked Billy with. They flipped off the light in the entryway and crouched down against the wall not far from the door. The killer heard footsteps just outside, and they clutched the knife tight. The door unlocked, and the killer saw it swing open. And before Debbie could even turn on the light or call to her husband, the killer leapt out of the darkness, grabbed her, slammed the blunt object into her head, and cut her throat too. Debbie's body collapsed just inside the door. The killer flipped on the light, put the knife back in their pocket, and grabbed Debbie's purse. They took out Debbie's car keys, and they saw a tube of lipstick. They walked into the family room, and with the lipstick, they scrawled the word narc on the wall over Billy's body. After that, they walked through the house, got the cleaning supplies they'd laid out in the kitchen, and then stepped over Debbie's body and went outside to her minivan. The killer opened the passenger door and saw the metal cash box on the floorboard. They found the key for the box on Debbie's keyring they'd stolen, opened the box, and stuffed the money from it into their pockets, getting blood from their hands all over the cash. The killer quickly wiped down the van with the cleaning supplies and tossed Debbie's keys onto the passenger seat. Then they ran to their car with their hands and pockets filled with cash, cleaning supplies, lipstick, and the murder weapons, and they drove straight home. The following morning, the killer woke up and saw several messages, but they ignored them and waited until later in the afternoon to go back to their parents' house. The bloody cash that Leonard had in his possession was the money from the cash box, but Leonard had told the truth. Another drug addict had given him that money. And this drug addict was Billy's son from his first marriage, Randy. And Randy was the killer. It turned out Randy's drug habit had been going on for years. He struggled to get work, and he almost never had any money. Billy had continually bailed his son out financially, but recently, Billy, and especially Debbie, had just had enough, and Billy had met with his son more than once to tell him they were cutting him off. On the night of the murder, Randy already felt angry and betrayed by Billy and Debbie, and so when he got to the house and saw his dad on the couch, he begged him to give him more money. But Billy said no way, he needed to get his act together and clean up his life. After that, Randy got the knife, argued with his dad again, and then attacked him on the couch with a blunt object, and then slit his throat. Hours later, Randy used the same weapons to kill Debbie. After murdering his dad and stepmom, Randy had the idea to try to make it look like a drug-related murder, so he wrote narc on the wall in lipstick. And he figured if that didn't work, police would assume this crime was connected to the earlier robbery at his parents' store. And Randy was right. Investigators focused on both of these theories. But during the investigation, Randy started to panic. And at one point, he literally tried to clean the blood off the cash he had stole in the laundry machine, but when that didn't work, he just gave the bloodstained cash to Leonard, assuming Leonard would hold on to it for him and keep quiet until the investigation died down. But Leonard called Agent Wheels and told him that Randy, who he'd known for a long time and who he did drugs with, was the person who gave him this money. Then, when Randy came in for questioning, he inexplicably shouted out that the blood-stained money was his. Wheels then moved in on Randy, his former Scholar Bowl rival, and had his car impounded. And the DNA sample that was taken from Randy's car door handle would match DNA samples from the crime scene. The blood belonged to Debbie. and Randy had just gotten some of it on his car after killing her. Randy was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but in 2016, he hanged himself in his prison cell. Michelle still thinks about her mother all the time, and she continually reminds people to hug the ones they love, because nobody, no matter how deep a connection they share, knows how much time they have together. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. In the early hours of Thursday, February 21st, 2008, a 6-year-old girl suddenly woke up to the sound of a creaking noise coming from the hallway just outside her bedroom door. It was a blustery night in rural Nevada, so she figured, the sound must just be the wind outside. But then she heard another noise that sounded more like footsteps, and this time it was even closer to her bedroom. Terrified, she pulled the covers up tight around her chin and looked straight down towards the crack in the door, out into the hallway. A moment later, she saw the outline of a person standing right outside her room. She squinted, trying to make out a face, wondering if maybe it was one of her parents checking in on her. But as quick as the shadow appeared, it vanished into thin air, and then a moment later, the little girl heard a loud bang. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the follow button's hairspray with bear repellent. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of February 7th, 2008, 36-year-old Ben Oxley pulled his truck into the parking lot at the Douglas County Fairgrounds, located near the town of Minden, Nevada, a half an hour east of Lake Tahoe. He killed the engine and then zipped up his jacket, racing for the windy, cold weather outside. Ben glanced in his rearview mirror, and he saw his 6-year-old daughter, Alyssa, sitting in the back seat. She was bundled up in her winter jacket, and she was grinning ear to ear. Alyssa had been looking forward to this night for weeks. It was the annual pre-Valentine's Day father-daughter dance, where dads brought their daughters to the local fairgrounds for a night of dancing and candy. Ever since Ben and his wife Melissa took Alyssa out shopping for a fancy new dress for this occasion, the dance had become all she could talk about. And Ben had been excited too. He jumped at basically any chance to make special memories with his daughter, especially given the trauma that she had endured over the past few years. He felt a pang of guilt just thinking about it. Ben's relationship with Alyssa's mother, Dawn, had always been rocky. They were divorced, but during their marriage and after, they had fought constantly. They had also both cheated on each other. Ben was short-tempered and angry while they were together, And even though they had broken up when Alyssa was just a toddler, he feared that relationship and its fallout had done lasting damage. They had shared custody of Alyssa for a while, but Dawn was a drinker, and Ben suspected she was also using other drugs. She also brought sketchy people home with her, and she was always broke with 100 excuses about why she couldn't hold a job. Ben felt like Dawn always blamed everybody else for all her problems, which was yet another thing that just drove him crazy. So a few years ago, he decided to just file for sole custody of Alyssa. It had been a very ugly court battle, but the judge ultimately ruled in his favor. And so Ben, after taking custody of Alyssa, had worked hard to make her life as stable as possible, even though he knew, every other weekend his daughter would go and see Dawn, and he really had no control over how that interaction went. But for now, Ben just pushed the thought of his ex-wife out of his head, and he stepped out of his truck. Then he opened up the passenger door and held his hand out for Alyssa, helping her climb out of the truck without getting dust on her brand new beautiful dress. The father and daughter followed the sound of the loud music across the parking lot and into the fairgrounds event building. Once inside, they found a very crowded party. Alyssa immediately saw a few friends waving at her from the dance floor, and so Ben helped her out of her winter coat and then watched as she went running across the room to say hello. Ben smiled to himself. He knew the drill with these father-daughter dances. Alyssa would run around with her friends for a few hours before eventually, right at the end, finding him for just the final dance of the night. That was it. But even though he really didn't see his daughter much during this dance, for him, as long as Alyssa was happy, he was happy. And in fact, Alyssa really did seem to be doing quite well these days. I mean, during the custody battle, she was very unhappy. And then initially, when Ben had begun dating his current wife, Melissa, Alyssa was, she was 2 years old, but she just didn't really like Melissa. But eventually she had adjusted to her and seemed to really like her. And, when he and Melissa got married a little over a year ago, nobody was happier about it than Alyssa, which had been a huge relief. And so now he's looking out, seeing his daughter, and it just seemed like she was super well adjusted and living her best life. And so Ben made his way over to the snack table and poured himself a glass of punch. Then he wandered over to a table full of other dads, and he sat down in one of the folding chairs and started chatting. A few hours later, the DJ came over the speaker and announced that it was going to be the last song of the night. And sure enough, Alyssa came running around the corner to find her dad. Ben took his daughter out onto the dance floor and twirled her around as the first notes of a song called Butterfly Kisses came on, which just so happened to be their special song. Ben tried his best to soak in every second of the dance. It had been a long road to get to a night like this. A couple weeks later, on the evening of Wednesday, February 20th, Ben cleared dinner plates from the dining room table while his daughter Alyssa, his wife Melissa, and Melissa's teenage brother Craig sat down in the living room to watch a movie. Craig had come to live with them a few weeks ago. His mother's new boyfriend had moved into his house, and Craig didn't like the boyfriend very much, so here he was. And for the most part, Craig fit right in, so his presence in the house really was not a big deal. Grocery bills had gotten more expensive, and the house was definitely more crowded, but these were minor inconveniences, and Ben was happy to give Craig a comfortable place to live. Ben set the dinner dishes in the sink, grabbed a bag of candy, and made his way into the living room where he sat down beside his wife. She had the movie queued up, and she rested her head on his shoulder and then hit play. And within minutes, Ben heard a quiet snore and knew that Melissa had fallen asleep. Ben passed the candy bag over to Craig and Alyssa for them to share, and then the family settled in for the movie. By the time it was over, only Ben and his daughter were the ones left awake. Ben sent Alyssa off to brush her teeth, then slowly he got up from the couch, trying hard not to wake up his wife. He guided her head down onto a pillow and then grabbed a blanket and put it over her. Craig was asleep on the other end of the couch, so Ben threw a blanket on him too. Then he turned off the TV and quietly made his way to the back of the house to tuck his daughter into bed. A few hours later, Ben's wife Melissa woke up in a panic, feeling totally disoriented and convinced she was late for work. It took her a minute to even realize she was on the couch in her living room, and then she looked up at the clock above the mantel and saw it was only 2:30 in the morning. And so she realized she must have fallen asleep during the movie again. She looked down at the other end of the couch and saw there was just a crumpled blanket where Craig must have been sitting. He must have fallen asleep too, but at some point before her, woke up and went to his own bed. Melissa rolled off the couch and then headed to the back bedroom, where she crawled into bed next to Ben, who was already fast asleep. And it felt like she had only just dozed off when suddenly there was this ear-splitting loud bang that ripped her from her sleep. Her ears were ringing and she was totally disoriented. She had no idea what it was. And so confused, she rolled over and tried to shake Ben awake, but he was fast asleep. And so she just pulled herself out of bed and went to go investigate the noise herself. As she walked out into the hall, she looked over at the nightstand and saw the clock said 3:30 a.m. So she'd only been asleep for maybe an hour. Once she was out in the hallway, she began walking around looking for Craig or Alyssa, but the house seemed empty. But at the end of the hallway, she felt this rush of cold wind, and she looked up and saw the front door was wide open, letting all the winter air blow in. And at that point, Melissa froze. Someone clearly had been inside their home. Terrified, she turned around and ran back to the back bedroom. She flipped on the light and was about to tell Ben to wake up, somebody's broken in, when she stopped. Because now, with the lights on, she could see the bed sheets were soaked with blood. Melissa called 911, and within minutes, 2 officers from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department pulled up in front of their home, which was a ranch out in rural Nevada. The officers stepped out of the cruiser with their guns drawn. They knew they were about to walk into an active crime scene, and there was a chance the perpetrator could still be on the premises. One officer pointed his flashlight and gun towards the house, illuminating the front door, which was wide open. He looked over at his partner. Dispatch had told them backup was on the way, but there was also an injured man inside this house. They couldn't wait for more officers to get here. They had to act now. So they moved towards the house. Once inside, they entered the living room, and it was dark, and there was no one in there. They turned into the hallway and made their way down until they stopped outside of a closed door on their immediate right. One of the officers let it swing open. They looked inside and shined their flashlights, and they could see it was a bedroom. In the beam of one of their flashlights, they could see that there was somebody hiding beneath a pile of covers on the bed. The officers shouted out, "Police!" and ordered the person to come out with their hands up, but the bundle of covers didn't move. The officers then heard ragged breathing coming from beneath the blankets. Slowly, they approached the bed and yanked off the covers, and a teenage boy whipped his hands into the air, visibly shaking as he screamed out that his name was Craig Nichols and he lived here. One of the officers told Craig to stay put. Then he told his partner to stay with Craig as he continued to go search the rest of the house. Back out in the hallway, that officer was about to continue his scan of the property when he turned and he nearly fell over when he saw this woman come barging out of a back bedroom, soaked in blood, and she was holding hands with this little girl who was sobbing to herself. The woman looked completely panicked, and she turned and saw the officer, and she could barely speak, but she just said, "My husband's in there," pointing to the bedroom, and she said he's badly injured. The officer nodded and realized this must be the woman who called 911, and so he rushed past her and the little girl and made his way into the back bedroom. But the second he looked down onto that bed, he knew this woman's husband was not just badly injured. This man was dead. 15 minutes later, Sergeant Ron Elges of the Douglas County Sheriff's Department stepped through the door of the small ranch home, which was now lit up outside with blue and red police lights, and inside with every light switch in the house flipped on. Crime scene techs were beginning to file in, and uniformed officers outside were keeping all the neighbors back. One of the first responding officers came to meet Sergeant Elges in the kitchen. He told him that a man named Ben Oxley was the deceased man in the back bedroom. He'd been shot in the head while he was asleep next to his wife Melissa, who had called 911. When the responding officer and his partner arrived, he said the front door of the house was wide open, and the only people inside the house were Melissa, her 16-year-old brother Craig, and her 6-year-old stepdaughter. And none of them said they saw or heard anything except for the 6-year-old. She said that she had heard floorboards creaking and had seen a shadow. The officer also said there was no sign of forced entry and nothing appeared to have been stolen. Elges nodded and thanked the officer for the info. Then he strode down the hallway to the back bedroom. Ben's body was still in the bed. Elges stepped closer to get a better look at the blood spatter on the sheets, and he noticed little pellets scattered all across the bed, which he immediately recognized as the remnants of a shotgun blast. But beyond the bed being just a grisly mess, nothing else in the bedroom was out of place. The killer had clearly snuck into the bedroom, taken their shot, and fled. Elges left the bedroom and went over to where Melissa was sitting on the couch in the living room, draped in a blanket and crying. The little girl was sitting next to her, looking terrified and confused. Elges wanted to speak to Melissa, but before he did, just by looking at her, he noticed something strange. Melissa had said she had been asleep next to Ben when he was killed, but she had no injuries, despite the fact that shotgun pellets had clearly sprayed across the bed. I mean, a shotgun is more of an area weapon. It fires in more than one direction. And interestingly, there really wasn't any blood spatter on her, not on her face, not on her clothes. She's laying next to her husband when he's shot with a shotgun. You would think blood would spatter all over her. And she did have blood on her, quite a bit, on her hands and arms, but it looked like it got there from her touching her husband after the fact. Just then, an investigator tapped Elges on the shoulder and let him know that they had found shotgun shells on a dresser in Craig's bedroom, as well as 2 actual shotguns in the garage, and that Craig, the 16-year-old, had said they were his. Elges glanced down at Melissa again, and then over towards Craig, who was sitting on his bed talking to an investigator. Then he looked at Alyssa, and he saw she was crying. As far as he was concerned, this little girl was the only certain victim here this evening. Melissa and Craig, on the other hand, he wasn't so sure. To him, this was clearly a murder committed by someone who knew Ben. After all, there was no attempt to rob the place, no sign of forced entry either, which meant whoever shot Ben either had access to the house or was already inside. Before leaving, Elges asked some of the officers to canvass the neighborhood to see if anybody had seen or heard anything suspicious. And then he told Craig and Melissa to get themselves organized because when they were ready, he wanted to see them down at the station for questioning. An hour later, Elges walked into an interview room at the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. Melissa was already sitting at a table waiting for him. Her face was red and puffy, and she was disheveled. She looked very distraught, and the moment she laid eyes on Elges, she just started bawling. Elges sat down in a chair next to her and pressed record on the tape player between them on the table. Then he told Melissa that he understood how difficult his request was going to be, but he needed her to walk him through what happened that night, step by step. And he needed to get her whole story on tape, because he needed to clear her as a suspect. Melissa gasped and grabbed a tissue from the box on the interview table. It seemed like the idea of her being a suspect had sent her into a new wave of sadness, and it took her a few minutes before she was calm enough to even speak. When she finally began rehashing all the details of the night, her voice was very shaky, and Elges couldn't help but feel like her grief seemed very sincere. But it was also hard to ignore the fact that if she was lying next to her husband when he was shot, she really should have had blood spatter all over her. And she should have been hurt by at least 1 or 2 of the shotgun pellets. And yet she had walked away with virtually no blood spatter and unhurt. And so Elges actually brought this up to Melissa. He said, "I think it's odd that these things are not here." And he watched for any signs of defensiveness in her response. But Melissa just shrugged and agreed that, yeah, it was strange. She must have just gotten very lucky or something. Elges nodded, but he was not necessarily convinced. And so he changed tactics, and he asked Melissa whether she knew if Ben had any enemies who might want to hurt him. Melissa sighed and explained that Alyssa's mother, Dawn, was a total nightmare, and she had some awful friends that Ben had fought with her about. Melissa said she and Ben barely let Alyssa spend any time at Dawn's house because Dawn's general lifestyle felt literally too dangerous for a small girl to be around. That information piqued Elges' interest, and so he knew one of his very next steps was going to be tracking down and speaking with Dawn. If Melissa was painting an accurate picture of her, Dawn could be a viable suspect. At that point, Elges stopped the tape recorder and told Melissa to hang tight. He might have other questions as the morning unfolded. Melissa nodded and took another tissue. Back in the hallway, an officer waved Elges down and handed him a report. Forensics had done a preliminary analysis of the shotgun pellets that they had collected from the scene, and they were a match for number 8 birdshot shells, which was the exact kind of shells that had been found in Craig's room. Elges raised his eyebrows. Then he thanked the officer and walked straight into the interview room next to Melissa's. This is where Craig was waiting. And only 15 minutes into the interview with Craig, Elges was even more suspicious of Craig. He answered every question with unnerving calm, like this was just a casual conversation, not an interview about a murder case. And so at some point, Elges just asked him point blank, did he kill Ben Oxley? Craig was quick to say no, and so Elges asked him if he would submit to a polygraph test. Craig said of course, whatever he could do to help, but he still looked weirdly calm. That is, until Elges stood up to go arrange for this lie detector test, at which point Craig's face suddenly crumpled and a loud sob escaped his mouth, and he burst into tears. The sudden flip of emotions really caught Elges off guard, and instinctively he walked over and offered Craig a tissue. Now, Elgis was not about to dismiss Craig as a suspect just because now he seemed to be having a more natural reaction to the death of a family member, especially when you considered the fact that there were number 8 shells found in Craig's room, the same type that were used to kill Ben. But for some reason, Craig's outbreak of emotion here made Elgis less convinced that this guy could be their killer. Elgis told Craig to stay put for a while. He wanted he and his sister to just stay at the station for the time being. Soon, forensics would come back with the results of a gunshot residue test. They had conducted it on Craig and Melissa when they first arrived, and it would tell them whether or not either of them had fired a shotgun in the last 24 hours. While Elgis waited for these results, he left the interview room to go grab a cup of coffee. He wanted to be on high alert when he met the next person he was bringing down to the station. Elgis was just finishing his first cup of coffee and about to pour a second one when a uniformed officer ducked her head into the break room and told him that Dawn, Ben's ex-wife, had just shown up. The officer also told Elgis that Dawn was aware that Ben was dead, and there was also one other thing that Elgis should know. And that was that a year ago, after a judge had given Ben full custody of his and Dawn's daughter, that he and Dawn had gotten into a physical fight. The cops were called, and they wrote up the incident as mutual domestic battery. No charges were filed, but still, their divorce was clearly a very messy one. Elgis nodded, left his coffee cup on the counter, and strode down the hallway toward interview room number 3. The second Elgis stepped inside the room, he smelled alcohol. Dawn was bleary-eyed and her hair and clothes were disheveled. She looked up at him and made this joke that she felt like she was in a cop show on TV. Elgis didn't react and just sat down across from her. But before he could ask her any questions, she just went off on Ben, saying what a bad guy he was and all these fights they'd gotten into, and Elgis began to think she must be drunk. It took him a few tries to get her quiet long enough to actually start their interview. However, once he got her to settle down, he was able to ask her what she'd been up to that night. Dawn began scratching her head and suddenly acting really cagey. She said that she was at home with her teenage kids, Devin and Brandy, and also their family friend, a 21-year-old named James Matleen. Dawn said she was good friends with James's mom, and James was almost like her surrogate kid. Dawn said they had all watched a couple of movies together before falling asleep around maybe 4 a.m, and that none of them ever left the house. Elgis smiled and told Dawn that was good. Everyone was accounted for. But Dawn didn't seem to be listening to him. She just started asking if Ben was really dead, over and over and over, until she got so worked up she started to cry. Finally, Elgis just shut off the recorder and told Dawn she was free to go. She nodded and fumbled with her purse for a while and slowly made her way out of the room. Dawn seemed like a mess, like somebody who would not have been capable of sneaking into somebody's house and shooting them only a few hours earlier. Elgis stepped out of the room, and a detective met him in the hallway to tell him that the gunshot residue test results on Craig and Melissa were back. Craig's hands were clean, meaning there was no way he could have fired a gun that night. But Melissa did have some residue on her. Now that could be because she was sleeping next to Ben when he was shot, but it could also be because she was the one who shot him. Elgis thanked the detective, then just stood there thinking. The way Elgis saw it, he had 2 compelling suspects. Melissa, who he just found out had gunshot residue on her, yet was strangely uninjured and didn't have blood spatter on her, and she was right next to Ben when he was killed. And Dawn, the ex-wife, who was this erratic, spiteful mess. He was fairly confident that Craig was not involved, and it was more likely that maybe Melissa stole his ammunition out of his room. But right now, Elgis was exhausted. He'd been up all night, and he knew he would be useless to this case if he didn't get some sleep. So he told the other investigators that he was going home for a nap. Then he would come back and look at the case with fresh eyes. The following day, on Friday, Elgis was back at his desk at the sheriff's department, sorting through a pile of notes and reports on Ben's case. He still liked Melissa or Dawn for this murder, and he had been hoping that the forensics team might be able to provide more evidence that would help guide his investigation. But the preliminary medical examiner's report had come back, and it only confirmed what Elgis already knew. Ben was killed with a shotgun at close range using a number 8 birdshot shell. Now, this was, of course, the same kind of ammo that was found in Craig's room, but the crime scene tech said that was not really actually incriminating. Number 8 birdshots were common ammunition for this part of Nevada, so it made sense that Craig might have a few rounds. Plus, neither of the shotguns that were found in Ben's garage had been fired recently, which meant that neither of them could be the murder weapon. And beyond that, there just hadn't been much evidence at all at the scene. Algis's team had canvassed Ben and Melissa's neighborhood, but none of the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. Officers also interviewed dozens of friends and family members, hoping to drum up some leads, but one after another, the only things people had to say were about what a great guy Ben was. And it looked like Dawn's alibi was going to check out. Another detective had spoken to James Matleen, the family friend who was watching movies with Dawn and her teenage kids on the night Ben was killed, and he corroborated her story. Her kids did too. They had watched 2 action movies, then passed out sometime around 4 a.m. Algis sighed, feeling stuck. He glanced over at his phone and saw he had a new voicemail. He put the phone to his ear. It was an insurance company, letting Algis know that they had some information he might find interesting. Ben had a $400,000 life insurance policy, and Melissa was the sole beneficiary. Now, this life insurance policy was not very new, and Melissa had been the beneficiary since the two got married. So this was not enough to bring her back down to the station for more questions, but still, it was all Algis really had, so he decided to keep a close eye on her. But over the next few days, Algis and his team struggled to find any further evidence that incriminated Melissa or anybody else. And so to help the investigation along, the Douglas County Sheriff's Department set up a secret witness reward that guaranteed $12,500 to anyone who came forward with information that led to an arrest. But still, no solid leads came through. The following week, on March 7th, so 15 days after the murder, Melissa and the rest of her family held a memorial service for Ben, and more than 400 people came to pay their respects. And for Algis, this confirmed what Ben's family had told him all along, that Ben truly was beloved. In the weeks that followed, that secret witness fund grew to over $22,000, and Ben's sister traveled all over Nevada hanging up posters to advertise the reward. But as weeks turned to months, the tip line stayed quiet and the case stalled out. Detective Algis was out of leads and desperate. And then, one hot morning in June, he heard a rumor that piqued his interest. Ben had only been dead for 4 months, but Melissa had already begun dating again. In Algis's opinion, this seemed pretty quick to move on, especially after your husband was murdered literally next to you in bed. Algis thought of the $400,000 life insurance payout that Melissa now had coming. And suddenly, he wondered if it might be time to bring her back down to the station after all. But a few days later, Algis sat at his paper-strewn desk, staring down unhappily at the results from a polygraph test that he'd administered to Melissa. Now, polygraphs are not 100% reliable, so they're typically not admissible in court. But still, Algis had sort of hoped that Melissa might fail her test when she was asked about Ben and the insurance money. But instead, Melissa had passed the test with flying colors. There was no deception detected. And so Algis was beginning to fear that this case was going to go completely cold. But just then, Algis's phone rang. It was another sergeant from his department, and he told Algis they had been going back through some of the evidence in Ben's case with fresh eyes, specifically some security footage from businesses near Ben's home. And they had found something they missed the first time, and they had just emailed it to him. Algis sat up in his chair, suddenly very alert. He thanked the sergeant and hung up, and then eagerly opened up his email. The footage he received was from a security camera in a 7-Eleven convenience store from around 1:30 in the morning on February 21st, so about 2 hours before Ben was murdered. In the footage, a person walked into the store with a baseball cap pulled down over their face, and they went up to the counter. And despite the hat on this person, Algis realized he recognized the person he was looking at. And with this, after months of stall out, he had a stunning new lead. He realized that all this time, someone he had spoken to during the investigation, that really he hadn't considered a suspect at all, had been lying to him. It would still take another full year and a risky plea deal to prove his theory, but finally, Sergeant Algis knew what happened to Ben Oxley. Based on evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews collected over the course of 18 months, this is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Ben Oxley in the early hours of February 21st, 2008. It was just after 3 in the morning. the killers slowly made their way through the Oxley house, down the hallway, towards the primary bedroom and back. They made their way into the room, and they walked over to Ben's side of the bed. There they looked down, and they saw him fast asleep. They raised their shotgun. Their plan was to kill Ben and then flee. But as they stood there with their shotgun raised right at his face, ready to fire, their conscience stopped them. Suddenly they thought to themselves, what am I doing? The killer just stood there, frozen. And that's when they heard a creak coming from the hallway right behind them, right outside of the kids' bedrooms. And the sound actually spooked them so badly that they jumped, accidentally squeezing the trigger, killing Ben instantly. At this point, the killer panicked and ran out of the bedroom, down the hallway, and out the front door, leaving it wide open behind them. They jumped into their truck and they drove away. It would turn out the killer was someone the police had spoken to early in the investigation, but they did not initially see them as a suspect. That is, until they discovered that 7-Eleven video surveillance footage, which showed the young man who Ben's ex-wife, Dawn Oxley, had claimed was just her family friend, James Matleen. The police had not suspected James, because they didn't think he had any connection to Ben or a motive to kill him. What they didn't know was that he and Dawn were actually romantically involved. And because Dawn hated Ben so much, James decided he too hated Ben. But even knowing this, police couldn't prove that James killed Ben until November of 2009, because that was when Dawn got arrested for driving under the influence, and prosecutors offered her immunity on the drunk driving charge in exchange for her testimony about James, and she took it. She told them James was the killer. It was not until police arrested James that a much more full version of the story finally came out. James told police that it was true, he did kill Ben. But he also told them that he only did it because Dawn wanted him to. Apparently, she still blamed Ben for losing custody of her daughter, Alyssa. James told police that Dawn actually went into the house with him that night to show him where Ben slept. He said it was Dawn, not him, that Alyssa saw standing outside of her bedroom door right before the shotgun blast, the so-called shadow she told police about. However, by the time the police learned this version of events, it was too late to charge Dawn with any crimes at all. They had already given her immunity in exchange for her statement. On March 16, 2012, a little more than 4 years after the murder, James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Dawn, who may have been the mastermind of a crime that she never did time for, she died at the age of 50 in the year 2022. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. On a morning in May of 2014, a detective sat next to the hospital bed of a mortally injured 77-year-old woman. This woman had been in a coma for the last 10 days following a vicious attack on her. And in that time, the detective had been desperately working to try to figure out who had attacked her. But now, somewhat amazingly, the woman had woken up from her coma, and now this detective was finally getting the chance to ask the victim directly, "Who did this to you?" However, when the woman began to speak, this conversation would not go as planned. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please take the follow button out for a beach day, but secretly replace their sunscreen with cooking oil. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late in the afternoon on May 6th, 2014, 77-year-old Helene Pastor sat at her office desk in Monaco with a phone pressed to her ear. And on the other end was one of Helene's many tenants, doing what they did best, which was to complain. This time there was a problem with their water heater, and apparently the plumber was late. And Helene, like she always did, listened patiently, because she was a landlord, and this was her job. But when this tenant was finished, Helene told them in a soft but firm voice that the plumber would be there eventually, and that they, the tenant, were certainly not too important to wait. Then she hung up. Helene knew her tenant wouldn't like this, but she also just didn't have patience for entitled, wealthy snobs. Unfortunately for her, though, she spent a lot of time with people like that, because Helene was actually the single richest woman in all of Monaco. So Monaco is a country located on the Mediterranean coast, and it's surrounded on three sides by France. And so Monaco and France share a lot of cultural similarities. But unlike France, Monaco is very, very small, just under a mile wide, and has only about 39,000 citizens. And many of those 39,000 citizens are incredibly wealthy. It's essentially a country of millionaires and billionaires living in ultra-luxury condos and high-rises all along its coastline. And Helene and her family, the Pastors, owned most of those condos, which meant they were among the wealthiest landlords not just in Monaco, but on the whole planet. The Pastors' multi-billion-dollar real estate empire had started 3 generations ago, and Helene was now in charge of it. It was a lot of work, and Helene could have passed it off to somebody else. But she was a Pastor, and Pastors worked for what they had. Which was why, despite her wealth, Helene was a very hands-on landlord and spent long days in her office with her staff, dealing with accounting and handling tenants' requests and complaints, like about, the plumber not being on time. Now, Helene picked up the phone once more to make one more call before she left for the day. And this call was to her daughter, Sylvia. Sylvia was 53 and had been diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years earlier. So Helene, naturally worried about her a lot and checked in with her daily. And on this day, when she heard her daughter pick up and say hello, Helene immediately asked her, how are you feeling? But Sylvia said she actually couldn't talk right now. Her massage therapist had just arrived, and so she excused herself and hung up. Helene took the phone off her ear and just stared at the receiver as the dial tone blared through it, doing her best not to feel hurt. Helene knew she was a very demanding parent and, generally was not particularly warm, but she loved Sylvia. And lately, it seemed like her daughter just didn't necessarily reciprocate that. And Helene knew exactly who to blame for this. And it was not Sylvia, and it wasn't even Helene. It was Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Now, Sylvia had been with Wojciech for almost 3 decades, and it seemed like everyone in Monaco absolutely loved this guy. I mean, he was charming and gregarious and gave a ton of money to charity. But Helene had always felt like there was just something off about him. And she worried that he was taking advantage of her daughter's very famous name. And so generally, there had just been this sort of sitting, unspoken tension between Helene and Sylvia about Wojciech. The fact that clearly Helene didn't really like him. Like that tension was there between the mother and daughter. But lately, it seemed like that tension had finally gotten to the point where, Helene and Sylvia were just having all these little arguments that, sometimes were actually about Wojciech and other times were about completely different things. It was like they were just quick to argue with each other. But for now, Helene looked at the time and saw, it was time to go. And so she stood up and she smoothed out her beautiful Chanel suit. And she knew that if she wanted to see her son Gildo tonight, she really needed to get a move on here. So Gildo, Helene's son, had been in the hospital for the last few months after having a stroke. Helene visited with him daily, making the 45-minute drive from Monaco to where he was hospitalized in Nice, France. Now, the daily commute was definitely a lot, but Helene didn't care. She always worked it into her very busy schedule. Now, Gildo was 47, but he was still very much Helene's child. And the whole ordeal had been just awful and very emotional for Helene, especially on top of, her daughter's cancer diagnosis and the tension between her and her daughter. Like, right now, life was pretty tough. Seeing her children like this had reminded Helene that money just could not save you from everything, even in Monaco. Now, Helene grabbed her Hermes purse and she headed out the door. Minutes later, Helene was outside and was climbing into a black minivan that was waiting for her at the curb. And as Helene slid into the back seat, she was greeted by her 64-year-old driver, Mohammed Darwish. So Mohammed had actually been working with Helene now for 15 years. And so the two of them spent the entire 45-minute drive to Nice just chatting about their kids, because in some ways they were, longtime friends. Mohammed told Helene about how he really missed his daughter, who lived back in Egypt with her mom, and he also updated Helene on his son, Wissam, and how he liked living in France. Their conversation made the drive go fast, and before Helene knew it, they were at the hospital. Around 6 p.m. that night, Helene was sitting at Gildo's bedside, helping him drink a glass of water. Like his mother, Gildo had been both blessed and cursed with the pastor work ethic. Despite the family money, he was constantly starting ventures and investing in businesses. So Helene knew the hospitalization had been really hard for him, not just physically, but just from a work perspective. He was missing out on so many opportunities because he was stuck here. And even though now he was awake and alert, he was still partially paralyzed and just couldn't speak very well. Helene sat with Gildo for about an hour, talking to him and also checking in with his doctors. And then at some point, she kissed her son's forehead and told him she would see him soon. Just after 7 p.m., Helene walked out of the hospital to where Mohammed was waiting in the minivan. And this time, she got into the front passenger seat. And Mohammed, he started the car, and they began to make their way out of the lot toward the busy streets of Nice. And pretty much right away, they got stuck in absolutely standstill traffic. And so Helene just sat back in her seat and tried to relax. But as she was doing that, something caught her eye outside of the car, like out her window. It was this person who had a hat kind of pulled down low over their eyes, and they were jogging right towards the minivan. And Helene, she just stared at this person and tried to see if they maybe knew them, because it did seem like they were coming right towards this car, like their car. But then she saw what this person was holding. And immediately she screamed at Mohammed to drive. But before Mohammed could react, Helene heard a loud bang and the sound of shattering glass. About 15 minutes later, the commissioner of the Nice police, Philippe Frison, pulled up to the hospital with the sirens on. He'd been in his office, about to finish up for the day, when he got a call about shots being fired, but he really didn't know how serious it was. So he parked and jumped out of his car, and the first thing he saw was a crowd of people gathered on the street across from the hospital. And they were all staring at this parked black minivan with Monaco plates and also a shattered passenger side window. Frison jogged over, and he was technically the first officer on the scene, but a firefighter standing by the minivan told him a few details based on what he'd seen and what the onlookers had been saying. Apparently, a man dressed in black had come out of nowhere on foot and fired 2 shots into the minivan, striking both the man and the woman who were in there in the head. The shooter had then disappeared back into the crowd, and witnesses saw a second man dressed in black follow after him. The firefighter said that both victims had been taken to the hospital in critical condition, but he didn't know, if they were still alive now, and he also didn't have any information on their identities, just that it was a man and a woman. Immediately, Frison's mind went to carjacking. Now, Nice did not have a huge amount of crime, but one of its more common issues was something called the car door grab, which was when criminals would target cars who were stuck in traffic, and they would rob these cars. And so he wondered if maybe carjackers had approached this vehicle and attempted to rob it. Something happened, they drew a weapon, and then obviously the victims inside were shot, and then the carjackers took off. And so Frison radioed back to the station for backup. A crime like this, whether it was carjacking or not, obviously what he's dealing with here is murder. A crime like this needed more officers than just him. And so he gets in touch with the dispatcher and he fills her in on the need for backup. And then during this discussion, she actually passes one more piece of information to Frison that she had recently learned. And that was the identities of the victims. And the reason that they already knew who these people were is because one of the victims was incredibly famous. The woman who had been shot was Helene Pastor. The other victim was her driver, Mohammed Darwish. When Frison heard this, he couldn't believe it. I mean, of course he knew who she was. Everyone in Monaco knew who Helene Pastor was, or at least had heard the Pastor name. And so now that Frison knew the identities of his victims, his theory of this case immediately changed. He felt like there was no way the richest woman in Monaco just happened to be targeted by random carjackers. I mean, this had to be a hit. And so Frizon, after getting off the radio, went back to the minivan and just looked inside. And right away, he saw there was a purse that was sitting untouched on the dashboard, which made him even more certain that this was no robbery. I mean, very likely that would have been grabbed. But then he noticed something else. The front seats and the floor of the minivan were covered in all these rounded metallic pellets, which he recognized as being from shotgun ammunition, like buckshot, like the inside of, what a shotgun fires or can fire. And this struck Frizon as being very strange. I mean, a shotgun was an odd choice for a professional hit, because it was big and bulky and you really couldn't carry it in public without attracting a lot of attention. And so this, combined with the fact that this happened in broad daylight, told Frizon that very likely whoever had shot Helene and her driver was not an experienced hitman, which was also just not what he would have expected. Just then, Frizon heard the sound of sirens cut through the air, and he knew his backup had arrived. A few hours later, Frizon was back at the police station talking to his team, which now included one of the city's very best detectives, investigator Catherine Messinio. Both of their victims, Mohammed and Helene, had survived, at least to this point. They were in comas, and their attack was already the leading news all around Europe. But Frizon was not particularly worried about, potentially not being able to solve this, because he knew he would have some answers soon. Not only had their technicians processed the crime scene and gathered swabs and other evidence from the minivan, but also Frizon's officers had found 2 security cameras near the scene that likely recorded the entire shooting. So in France, it was common for cities and towns to have like a network of closed-circuit surveillance cameras that law enforcement was able to access. And Nice had more of those cameras than any other city in the country. So Frizon was optimistic about what the footage might show once it finally arrived. But in the meantime, he wanted to speak to Helene's immediate family and friends and see if she had any enemies. The way Frizon saw it was, Helene's daughter and son, who she was very close with, Sylvia and Gildo, they would certainly know if there was anyone who wanted their mother dead. But Frizon also knew that her children were not just potential sources of critical information. They were also suspects. Frizon didn't have access to the details of Helene's estate, but he knew enough about the family to guess that whatever inheritance Helene left behind was literally in the billions, which meant that her death would likely make both Sylvia and Gildo billionaires. Now, Frizon didn't think that either of them had actually pulled the trigger here, but what Frizon did think was that both of them definitely had the motive and the means to hire somebody else to do the shooting. But Frizon had one big problem. Sylvia and Gildo, and really all of the people he really wanted to speak to, lived in Monaco. And since Frizon and his team were French, and this crime had happened in France, they had no jurisdiction in Monaco. So, in order to speak to Helene's children and her inner circle, they couldn't just walk up and demand an interview. Instead, they basically had to ask nicely. The next morning, Frizon sat in a very expensive-looking living room overlooking the beautiful Monaco harbor. Now, Frizon had been up all night and was basically running on fumes at this point, but he hoped, that was going to be worth it, because sitting across from him was Helene's daughter, Sylvia Pastor, and her 64-year-old boyfriend, Wojciech Janowski. When Frizon had reached out to Sylvia and Wojciech and asked them to speak with him, one, he had been sort of surprised at how quickly they had agreed to do it, but two, he sensed really not much emotion. Like they were sort of cold and detached and sort of quick to be like, sure, we'll meet up and chat with you about this, as if it was just no big deal. But now that he was face to face with them, it was clear that they were absolutely devastated. Especially Sylvia. Now, Frizon knew as much as he wanted to ask some sort of pointed questions here, he needed to be very careful, because Sylvia and Wojciech did not have to be speaking to him at this point. Like, they basically are just agreeing to do this interview, and at any point, they can say, enough, leave, and he would have to go. So Frizon, when he began, he just started out with some very light background questions about Helene. And in a very shaky voice, Sylvia described her mother as being very tough, but incredibly generous. She said they did fight a lot, but it was just over silly things, and they were actually, pretty close. Sylvia said she'd been battling breast cancer, and her mother had always called to check in, like she really cared. When Frizon asked about enemies, Sylvia shook her head, and she said, obviously, my mother is worth a ton of money, and so by default, she is a target. but she really didn't get out much. She didn't really engage with the Monaco social scene. She pretty much just worked all the time and looked after the family. Like, she just kept to herself. So I certainly can't think of anybody that would have wanted to harm her. When Frizon turned to Wojciech seemed equally mystified by this whole thing. He told Frizon that he and Sylvia had been together for 28 years and they had a daughter together. And so, he knew Helene very, very well. And he said that, his relationship with Helene had always been great and that Helene generally was like this incredibly generous person. I mean, especially really with him and with Sylvia. He said that even though he had his own businesses and his own income, totally separate from the pastors, Helene still would give him and his family money. The mention of finances, though, made Frizon perk up. And so he asked Wojciech to be more specific about the type of financial generosity he was describing. And when he asked that question, Frizon noticed there was this look of uncertainty that crossed Wojciech's face. And for a second, Frizon wondered if he had just touched on something that was kind of a sore spot. But Wojciech went from looking uncertain to sort of recovering very quickly, and then an easy smile came across his face, and he explained that Helene gave her daughter and son, so Sylvia, his girlfriend, and Gildo, a monthly allowance of about 500,000 euros each, which was around 600,000 US dollars. When Frizon heard this, he had to force himself not to reflexively raise his eyebrows, because this was like a staggering amount of money to get every single month as just an allowance. It was so high, in fact, that it made Frizon doubt whether either of Helene's children would feel a need to kill her. I mean, if she's already giving them this much money every month, what else do you need? But Wojciech wasn't done. He cleared his throat and sort of shifted in his seat like he was uncomfortable. And then he said that, he and Sylvia used this very generous amount of money that Helene gave them on household expenses. But, Wojciech said if he was being honest, he'd heard that Gildo spent it on other stuff. Wojciech said, Sylvia's brother, Helene's son, he owned some companies that were not doing well. And so he was in very deep debt. For Frizon, he couldn't tell if this was true or not, but it certainly opened up a new investigatory door. So he jotted down this information on his notepad. He was actually meeting with Gildo next. And so if Wojciech was right, then this debt was definitely a huge red flag. 45 minutes later, when Frizon walked into Gildo's hospital room, he was shocked by what he saw. Now, he had known that Gildo was sick, but he really hadn't been prepared for just how sick. Gildo could barely move or speak. The only way he could communicate was actually by blinking. But nonetheless, Frizon sat down by his bedside and began with a few simple questions. It took a long time for Gildo to blink out his answers, and he really couldn't communicate anything more than a few words at a time. And it was also just kind of obvious to Frizon that even with these short answers, he just was not going to get much. And as time was going by, Gildo was just getting more and more frustrated with basically his lack of being able to contribute much here. And so by the time Frizon left the hospital, not that long after he had arrived, he was very doubtful that Gildo was really in any shape to be planning a hired hit. I mean, the guy really was just not doing well. But, it was still possible, at least Frizon thought it could be, that Gildo had begun preparations before his stroke, which had only happened 2 months earlier in March. And Frizon realized the amateurish quality of the hit itself could have actually been a product of Gildo's illness, like he had to rush the hit because he basically could barely communicate. So far, Frizon thought this case was basically full of contradictions. One of the richest people on the planet had almost been assassinated by shockingly unprofessional hitmen. Both of the children, both of Helene's kids, stood to inherit billions and billions of dollars and were therefore the most obvious suspects. But at the same time, both kids were receiving an ungodly amount of money already. Like they didn't need the money. And I mean, even if Gildo was in debt, the idea that $500,000 every month isn't enough to at least keep you afloat just seems sort of fishy. And so Frizon began to wonder about Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Could he have planned the hit? Because he, not Sylvia, wanted access to Helene's money? And so Frizon pulled out his phone and he called Massinio, the very talented detective, the best in the city. And he told her about, what he saw as issues about having Sylvia and Gildo as suspects. Massinio completely agreed with Frizon. And then she shared something that she had learned during her own interviews about Wojciech. She said that one of Helene's friends told her that Sylvia had been with Wojciech so long, 28 years, without getting married because Sylvia wanted to make sure her inheritance went to her or her child or just stayed within her direct family bloodline and didn't go to an outsider, to a husband. Frizon considered what this meant. It told him that Sylvia didn't completely trust Wojciech, but it also tanked his theory that Wojciech might have planned the hit, since he had zero claim to the Pastor estate, whether Helene was alive or not. But then, Messinio said something else that made Frizon stop thinking about the Pastors completely. She said she had found something out about Helene's driver, Mohammed. Mohammed was apparently involved in a love triangle, and had been for years. He was from Egypt, and he had a family there, but he also had a mistress here. And Messinio had gotten the number for Mohammed's adult son who lived with him in France, so they could just ask him about it. And so as Frizon hung up the phone, his mind was spinning. I mean, this whole time, he had thought it was so obvious who the target of the hit was. It had to be Helene. She's this billionaire. It's gotta be her. But now he was wondering if maybe the real target was Mohammed. That afternoon, Frizon was back at the station with Messinio. It had been 24 hours since the shooting, and neither of them had slept. But Frizon did not think they'd be able to do that anytime soon because the security camera footage had just arrived. And Frizon had put a lot of stock into this footage. Like, he felt really hopeful that this was going to be what they needed, because it felt like every other lead he had tried to follow so far in this case had already hit some kind of dead end. He'd just gotten off the phone with Mohammed's son, Wissam, who he had hoped, might shed some light on the possibility that Mohammed was the intended target of the attack. But Wissam had been skeptical. He did not think the lead about his father's love triangle meant very much. He said the mistress had been a part of Mohammed's life for a long time, and to be honest, nobody was particularly upset about it. Now, unlike Sylvia and Gildo, Wissam was a young and healthy man, so theoretically he could have been one of the shooters. But Frizon hadn't heard anything in their call that made him think Wissam wanted to kill his father, or Helene for that matter. So now, Frizon and Messinio began scrolling through the security footage, looking for clues that could maybe point them in the right direction. When they got to the point in the recording where the shooting actually happened, they were relieved to see they did have a clear view of the scene, and they watched it play out right in front of them. And just like the witnesses had said, Helene's car is seen turning out of the hospital parking lot, and then a man with a shotgun approached her window and fired twice. Frizon could see that the second man watched the whole thing from across the street at a snack bar, probably acting as a lookout, and then after the shooting, both men ran away on foot, and their faces were never visible in the footage. And so Frizon rewound the tape to see when these men arrived, and he saw they showed up about 20 minutes before the shooting. But it was not when they showed up that was particularly significant. It was how they showed up. When Frizon saw how they arrived, his jaw dropped, because finally he'd found the lead he could follow. Both men were separately driven to the hospital in taxis, and one of the taxi's license plates was clearly visible on screen. That evening, Frizon, Messinio, and a group of officers burst into the lobby of Hotel Azur in Nice. In Frizon's hand was a photo of both of the shooters. After calling the taxi company, everything had moved very quickly. The taxi dispatch had a record of these two men's rides and gave detectives the mobile numbers that were used to book each cab. And it didn't take long for Frizon's team to connect those numbers to two burner phones that were purchased just hours before the shooting at a store about 2 hours away from the hospital in a French city called Marseille. And then, by using closed-circuit camera footage, the police have been able to track the shooters' movements prior to the shooting. First, as they left that store with their burner phones, and then as they boarded a train to Nice, and then stopped at Hotel Azur before getting taxis to the hospital. So that's why Frizon and his team were at the hotel now. In order to find out who planned this attack, they needed to ID the shooters, and they were hoping somebody here could. So Frizon approached the reception desk with the picture of the shooters and asked the person manning it if they had seen either of the men in the photo. And the receptionist said yes. Those men had rented 2 separate rooms just the day before, but they'd already checked out. And so Frizon wrote down the names the receptionist gave him for these 2 men, but the names were not familiar. Then, Frizon and Messinio split up to actually go search the rooms. Moments later, Frizon and some officers hurried into a very clean hotel room. And the receptionist had told him that this was going to be the case because the maids had already been in and out of that room. They had cleaned it. And so for Frizon, even though he did expect, a clean room, it was still disappointing to walk in there and see it because, had there been any evidence still in here, by now it was very likely gone. However, just then he heard one of his officers call out from the bathroom. And so Frizon went in there and found one of his officers pointing to where a used bottle of shower gel sat on the side of the tub. Frizon couldn't believe it. He knew no other guests had been in this room since the shooters had been, which meant that gel was almost certainly theirs. The maids must have missed it during their cleaning. And so Frizon told the officer to bag it. It was a long shot, but he wanted to maybe get it sent off and tested for DNA. On May 16th, 2014, investigators Frizon and Messineo paced around Frizon's office. Every now and again, they glanced at a document that was sitting on the desk. It had only been 10 days since Helene Pastor and her driver, Mohamed Darwich, were shot outside a hospital in Nice, France. Helene was still alive and in a coma, but Mohamed Darwich had died, which meant Frizon was now officially leading a murder investigation. Now, this was daunting for Frizon, but at the same time, he felt like they were close to breaking this case, because that document on his desk told him that the shower gel they collected during a search of the shooter's hotel rooms actually did have DNA on it. And it had matched to someone in their system, a 24-year-old man named Samin Saeed Ahmed. And through a series of phone taps, they'd also managed to figure out the name of Samin's accomplice, a 31-year-old man named Al-Hayir Hamadi. Now, these names were different from the ones that the hotel had given Frizon, so clearly the men must have used pseudonyms when they checked into that hotel. Now, both of them did have prior criminal records, but like Frizon had suspected, they were not like professional killers. They were just petty criminals and drug dealers from a neighborhood in Marseille that had the highest crime rate in the entire country. So it sort of did make sense that two men from that area might agree to carry out a hit for money. But what didn't make sense to Frizon or Messineo was how Samin Saeed Ahmed or Al-Hayir Hamadi could possibly be connected to anybody in Helene's life. The Pastors and their inner circle were some of the richest people in the world. If any of them were planning a hit, Frizon would have expected them to hire, more experienced and professional assassins. So now Frizon wondered if maybe they needed to take a closer look into other areas of Helene's life, like maybe her tenants, to see if anyone had obvious connections to Marseille. He knew from speaking with Helene's friends that she often handled many of her tenants personally, and so it was possible that maybe there was a feud or dispute that they just didn't know about. However, thousands of people lived in Helene's buildings. Going through that list would be nearly impossible, which was why Frizon and Messineo had decided that the best way to approach this whole thing was with a method Frizon called the fishing rod. Instead of arresting the shooters, Samin and Al-Hayir, they would watch them and keep their phones tapped and see if they led police to whoever hired them. However, while they were figuring all this out, Frizon's phone suddenly rang, and when he answered it, he got very unexpected news. It was the hospital. Helene had woken up from her coma. And so first thing the next morning, Frizon sent Messineo to the hospital to interview Helene, and then after sending her out, Frizon waited anxiously at the station for her to return. He was hoping that Helene could simply tell Messineo who wanted her dead, and then they could just close the case. Easy. But when Messineo came back that afternoon, she did not have good news. Helene had told Messineo that she was terrified, and she had lots of things that she wanted to tell the police. And at one point, she seemed like she was on the verge of actually, giving Messineo a name or just something really meaningful. But then she'd literally just struggled to breathe, and medical staff had rushed in to stabilize her, and they hadn't been able to finish the interview. Frizon was so disappointed. They'd been so close to maybe hearing the truth directly from the mouth of their victim. And now they might never know. It would turn out 4 days later, before the police ever had a chance to have another interview with Helene, she died. Two weeks after Helene's death, so in early June of that year, Frizon parked his car and began to walk into the station to start his day. And he was feeling incredibly anxious because Helene and Mohamed's case had really stagnated, and Helene's death really only made the public pressure on him and his team way more intense. Frizon still had his team watching the shooters and tracing their phone calls, but so far they hadn't gotten any more leads from that. They were also slowly chipping their way down the list of Helene's tenants, but so far they hadn't found anyone with the kind of motive they were looking for. Frizon had not totally eliminated his first suspects, which were Gildo, Sylvia, and Wojciech, but he just didn't feel like any of them stood out above the rest. Gildo potentially needed a windfall because of alleged money problems, although Frizon had not confirmed that with bank records. But Gildo's poor health made it extremely unlikely he could have planned this hit. Then there was Sylvia, who was entitled to an enormous inheritance from her mother's death, but she already had a massive monthly allowance when her mother was alive and really did not seem desperate for cash at all. And then as for Wojciech, he wasn't even married to Sylvia, so he literally had no legal claim to the Pastor estate. So Helene's death really didn't do him any good. So all this was sort of going through Frizon's mind as he stepped inside the station. And as he did, right away he saw Messinio come running towards him carrying a piece of paper. And this paper was covered in lines of numbers that Frizon immediately recognized as a call log. And Messinio explained that they had traced one of Alhair's recent calls and finally found a link to Monaco. The guy he called was somebody named Pascal Doriac, and unlike the shooters, Pascal had direct ties to Monaco. He was a personal trainer, and some of his clients were elite families who lived in Monaco. And a few of those clients were also people that Frizon and his team had examined in connection with the murders. Frizon grabbed the piece of paper and read and reread its contents before he finally looked up at Messinio and said they needed Pascal's phone records right now. Later that same day, Frizon was sitting at his desk staring at a name written on a piece of paper. He had gotten access to Pascal's phone records, and he discovered that every time there had been a significant event in this entire case, like on the day of the actual shooting or the days of Mohammed or Helene's death, Pascal had texted the same number. And now that Frizon knew who that number belonged to, he realized he had been at least half right the whole time. These murders were about money. Based on the police investigation, multiple confessions, video surveillance, and bank records, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helene Pastor and Mohammed Darwish on the evening of May 6th, 2014. Around 7 p.m., the hitman named Samin Saeed Ahmed strode toward Helene's black van. And as he did, he could see her terrified face through the passenger side window as she realized what he was carrying, a shotgun, and she looked at her driver and screamed at him to drive. But before Mohammed, the driver, could hit the gas, he had raised his shotgun and fired twice into the passenger side door. And then Samin just stood there and watched as Helene and Mohammed sort of slouched forward in their seats and began to convulse. Samin didn't know who the people were he just shot. But he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the payday he was about to receive for doing this. After a moment, Samin was convinced that he had been successful, that Helene and Mohammed were dead. And so he turned and sprinted away as fast as he could, knowing that his accomplice, Alhair, would follow shortly after, just like they had planned. And so Samin, as he ran away, he pulled his baseball hat down over his eyes, hoping that would be enough to avoid any cameras that might be in the area. And he ran through the streets of Nice, eventually slowing to a walk before going inside of his hotel, where once he was inside, he went to his room, sat on his bed, and he called the man who hired him. Across the city, Pascal Doriac, the personal trainer, heard his phone ring, and he politely told the client he was with that he'd be right back. He then grabbed his phone and hurried out of the personal gym he had just been in, and he stepped into this grand marble hallway to take the call. And what he heard on the other end of the line was Samin telling him the good news, that the job was done. Pascal smiled, he hung up, and then he began typing out a text message. This text message was for the real killer, that is, the person who'd actually ordered the hit in the first place, to let them know that everything had gone off without a hitch. Seconds later, the real killer looked down and saw they had just gotten a text message, and it was from Pascal, their trainer. And as soon as they saw that, their heart began to race. They were very nervous about what this text was going to say. But eventually they scooped up their phone and they opened the message. But when the real killer read what was on their phone, they felt this enormous sense of relief that they hadn't felt in years, because their plan sort of unbelievably had worked. Then the real killer just sank back down in their comfy, expensive couch and looked out their window at an amazing view of the Monaco harbor. It would turn out Sylvia's boyfriend of 28 years, Wojciech Janowski, was lying about everything. It was Wojciech, not Gildo, who was drowning in debt. Wojciech claimed to be this very successful businessman, but in reality, all the companies that he was involved with were failing and in deep financial trouble. This had been going on for years, and Wojciech had just been swindling his girlfriend Sylvia out of her assets and monthly allowance to stay afloat. And when Sylvia was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, he panicked. They weren't married, so if she died, he'd lose everything. But he believed if Sylvia inherited the family fortune all at once, he could easily steal it from her and wipe out his debts. Wojciech had also been lying to investigators about his relationship with Helene. The reality was, they hated each other. Helene was very suspicious, rightfully so, that Wojciech was after the Pastor family fortune. In 2018, Wojciech was found guilty of murdering both Helene and Mohammed and was sentenced to life in prison. The other accomplices, Pascal Doriak, Samin Saeed Ahmed, and Al-Hayir Hamadi, all received between 22 years and life in prison. As for Gildo, he would eventually recover from a stroke and he moved to the United States, while Sylvia, at least as of 2025, is still alive, and she would give Mohammed's son a job and let the Darwich family live in one of her family's properties. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So, that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. On a September afternoon in 2000, an FBI forensics analyst stood in her lab in Quantico, Virginia, staring into a microscope in confusion. She was looking at 2 strands of hair that were evidence in a murder investigation, and something just wasn't right. She checked the label on the evidence bag the sample came from, and then looked back into the microscope, and she knew she was not imagining this. The label had to be wrong, which meant that the detective who had packaged the hairs and sent them over here for analysis had not understood what he was even looking at. And this was not a small mistake, because if the analyst was right about what these hairs really were, then this entire murder investigation was about to change. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do when we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, make the follow button jealous by posting pictures of yourself with other cooler buttons like the subscribe button. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early evening of July 19, 2000, 22-year-old Misty Morse carried her surfboard out of the water and onto the beach in Indian Harbor Beach, Florida. She laid the board down on the sand, then sat down next to it to catch her breath. Her heart was still racing from the last wave she had just caught, and the adrenaline was exactly what she needed. Between her waitressing job and her sales clerk job and the community college courses she was taking, she basically had no time to do anything for herself. And so to get out here and to be out on the ocean and just be away from it all was not only a great respite, but was also very calming for her. And so, looking out over the horizon, she dug her feet into the sand and watched the waves until her heart rate finally slowed down. After a few minutes, Misty got back up and carried her board over to some rocks where she had left her bag. She needed to check the time, because she was going out with her friends later, and she still needed to get home to shower and have dinner and get ready. And as she reached her bag, she heard her phone ring. So she pulled it out and saw the name of the person who was calling her, Ricky Franklin. And she was about to pick it up, but then she stopped. Ricky was one of the guys that she was seeing. They'd gone out with some friends together yesterday, and then watched a movie afterwards, just the two of them. But Misty wasn't so sure. Ricky was a sweet guy, but he called a lot, and Misty had a feeling he wanted to be more serious than she did. And she just wasn't looking for that, because she was having fun sort of dating around. Aside from Ricky, she was also seeing another guy named Teddy Underwood, who she actually did really like. Misty worked with Teddy's sister at a restaurant, and they'd gone out a few weeks ago, and it had been great. They had a lot in common, and it just felt easy to be around him. So she hoped that they would keep on hanging out, and who knows, maybe that would become more serious, and maybe she'd be open to that. So Misty let Ricky's call go to voicemail, and then tossed her phone back in her bag. She wasn't quite sure what she was going to do with him yet, but she figured she would talk it out with her friends later that night. Misty checked the time and saw it was 7 p.m., so she had to hurry. She peeled off her wetsuit and organized her things, and as she was getting ready to go, she heard barking. And she turned and saw this shaggy dog run past her with its owner. And immediately, it gave Misty this wave of sadness, because it reminded her of her old dog, Chiba. Misty used to share Chiba with her ex-boyfriend, Brent Huck, and she loved that dog more than anything. But when she and Brent broke up, and Misty moved in with her mom, her apartment complex didn't allow for dogs. So Misty had to leave Chiba behind, and she really missed her. But Misty had seen Chiba a few times recently, because Brent, despite being her ex, was actually still another person that Misty was seeing right now. Just more like a friends with benefits thing, not a relationship. Now, Misty knew this very likely was a bad idea, because their relationship had been fraught with drama, and Brent now had a girlfriend as well. But being with him felt nice and familiar, and plus she got to see the dog. So she'd been putting off ending things. And so Brent was yet another thing she was planning to talk about that night with her friends. And so after watching the dog and the owner run off, Misty turned, dusted the sand off her legs, picked up her board, and walked off the beach, headed for home. Less than 10 minutes later, Misty walked into the apartment she shared with her mom, Linda, and dropped her stuff next to the door. She made her way into the kitchen, where there was a big plate of lasagna her mother had left for her, along with a note that read, "Sleeping, eat up." This was pretty typical. Misty's mom, Linda, was a bookkeeper, and so she always had to get up really early in the morning to get to work, and so she was usually in bed by the time Misty got home at night. And so Misty happily grabbed a fork and sat down at the table to dig in. And as soon as she did, her phone rang. And when she checked it, she sighed, because it was Ricky again. This time, though, she decided to answer it and see what he wanted. And he told her he was just calling to touch base, and also wanted to make sure they were still on for Friday. Misty felt sort of annoyed by this, but she did tell him they were good for Friday, and then they talked for maybe a minute or so before she told him that she had to go. After dinner, she spent the next few hours watching TV and texting her friends about their plans for the night. They were all going to drive to the Holiday Inn Beachside Hotel bar, which was just a short drive south. A little after midnight, Misty took a shower and did her hair. Then she tiptoed to her mother's room and pushed open the door. She could see her mom sleeping in the darkness and felt bad waking her up. However, Misty did want to check in before she went out. So she walked over and gently shook her mother awake. And when Linda opened her eyes, Misty did a spin and asked how she looked. And even though she was very groggy, Linda smiled and said, "You look great." Misty gave her a kiss and said she was heading out in the next hour or so, but she'd be home tomorrow. And also, could she borrow her mother's car to see a movie? Linda mumbled yes and closed her eyes again. Then Misty slipped back out of the bedroom. And about an hour and a half later, Linda woke up again. And when she did, she heard the sound of Misty's cell phone ringing just outside of her room. 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, a man was at his home on the banks of the Indian River, located about 22 miles away from Misty's home. He'd gone outside to enjoy the last few moments of his weekend, and he was just taking in his beautiful view of the water. However, when he walked down to the edge of the river, he noticed something floating in the current towards him. It was large, gray, and slick, and even from several feet away, he could tell it was a dead manatee, which actually was not unusual for the area. The Indian River was a mix of salt and freshwater, and it was connected to the ocean, so it was a big feeding ground for manatees. But when this manatee floated past him, the man's stomach twisted, because now that he was getting an actual close-up view, he realized it was not a manatee at all. The man stumbled backwards, then turned around and ran to his house to call 911. Within the hour, Agent Gary Harrell, who was an investigator with the Brevard County Sheriff's Department, stood on a dock downriver from a private home on the Indian River in Florida, and he was staring at the water, where the body of a dead woman with reddish-brown hair floated face down near the dock, caught between some trees and some rocks. All around Harrell, the area was swarming with investigators, taking photos and looking for evidence. A dive team was also nearby, preparing to wade into the river with a body bag to get the floating woman onto dry land so Harrell could examine her. Harrell didn't want to rush them, but at the same time, he did need them to hurry, because the longer the body was in the water, the more physical evidence the current would wash away. And it wasn't just the loss of tissues or fibers that Harrell was worried about. It was also the condition of any wounds on her body that might tell him how she died. Both moving water and marine life could damage a body, which could obscure the cause of death. The only information Harrell had at this moment was that this woman had been spotted floating down the river by a man who ended up calling 911. And Harrell didn't know who she was, how she got in the water, whether this was accidental or intentional, and now it seemed like the water was washing away any clues that might help him figure all that out. So Harrell watched anxiously as the dive team wrapped the woman in the bag and then pulled her onto shore. Once she was on dry land, Harrell hurried over to take a look. And as soon as he laid eyes on the body, he knew he had enough evidence to make at least one determination. This was no accident. This woman had been murdered. She was naked, and there was white duct tape across her eyes, and some loose tape that was around her neck, which Harrell assumed had at one point been in her mouth, but then slid down. Her hands and feet were also bound, except by rope, and Harrell could see that the rope she was tied up with was sort of unusual. It was a red and white diamond pattern with a big knot in it. There were also 2 ripped plastic bags that were tied to her feet, which Harrell guessed had once contained rocks or something else that was heavy to weigh her down. They very likely at some point ripped on the rocky river bottom, and then at that point she floated up to the surface. So whoever killed her must have tried to sink her body in hopes that it would never be found. Harrell just shook his head. He also suspected, since the woman was naked, that she had been the victim of sexual assault as well. But that was all he could guess right now. The woman was so bloated and already so decomposed, he couldn't even tell how old she was. He assumed she'd been in the water for at least a few days, which meant it was unlikely they'd be able to recover any DNA or forensic evidence from her body. But Harrell did have a few things to work with. The rope could be analyzed. It had that distinctive pattern, so it might be traceable. Harrell also made a mental note to show it to the Coast Guard too, in case there was a boating or marine connection. And he was excited about the duct tape. Tape is an adhesive and can collect and hold on to things like hair or skin or other materials, even in a harsh underwater environment. So Harrell asked a nearby crime tech to photograph and bag all the items and then get her body ready to transport to the coroner's office. Harrell hoped the medical examiner would be able to find some more clues during the autopsy, like how his victim died, when she died, and most importantly, her name. The following afternoon, so July 24th of 2000, Harrell parked his cruiser in front of an apartment complex in Indian Harbor Beach. He'd just come from the autopsy, and he had been right about the condition of the woman's body. It was so deteriorated, the medical examiner couldn't figure out when she died or how she died. He couldn't even tell whether she was alive or dead when she went into the water. But the medical examiner's best guess was that she either drowned or she suffocated from the tape or from someone putting a hand over her mouth and nose to smother her. She didn't have any drugs in her system, and there were no bullet wounds, stab marks, or broken bones. There was also no evidence of sexual assault that they could see, but again, it was very hard to tell. And even though there were a lot of unknowns here, this examination had told Harrell a few key things. The first was that his victim was not thrown into the river from a bridge or cliff because she didn't have that kind of trauma or physical injury to her body. whoever had killed her had most likely dropped her sort of gently into the water, likely from a boat. And the woman did not have any defensive wounds, which could mean a lot of things. Like, for example, maybe her killer had a weapon, and they used that to scare her into compliance without any sort of physical fight. But Harold thought it was more likely that she didn't physically fight back because she knew and trusted her killer. For one thing, women are more likely to be killed by an intimate partner. And also, there was no evidence of sexual assault, and that made a stranger attack a lot less likely, since she was not targeted for the purpose of assaulting her. She was targeted for potentially something very personal. Plus, there was the tape over her eyes. Harold didn't think that was about the killer protecting their identity. There was no chance of a dead victim identifying you. Harold thought it was the kind of thing you do if you know your victim personally, and you can't stand your victim staring at you while you kill them. But the biggest lead Harold had gotten from this autopsy was her identity. They had taken the woman's fingerprints and found a match. She was 22-year-old Misty Morse. So now Harold was in front of Misty's apartment, where he'd learned she lived with her mom, Linda Morse. And as the detective sat in his car, he took a deep breath, because no matter how many times he had done this, notifying loved ones about a death was always awful. As he made his way to the door and knocked, he felt this pit in his stomach. Moments later, a woman opened the door. Harold figured this had to be Linda, and as soon as he introduced himself, he saw her facial expression change. She gasped, and her eyes filled with tears as she asked, "It was her, wasn't it?" Harold was sort of caught off guard before he realized that news outlets had already been reporting that a body had been found in the river. Now, they had not released Misty's name yet, but he guessed that Linda must have seen the news and had been filled with dread ever since that was her daughter. So he just replied that yes, it was her, and her death looked like a homicide. And when he said that, Linda just broke down and began to sob. About a half an hour later, Harold was sitting inside the apartment, across the kitchen table from Linda. She had calmed down enough to give a statement, but she was still having trouble speaking. In a shaky voice, she told Harold that the last time she saw her daughter was 4 days earlier, on July 20th. She said Misty had woken her up after midnight to say goodbye, and then she left a while later to go out and see some friends at a bar. Linda began to cry as she explained she hadn't seen or heard from Misty since, and she'd been so worried. But Misty was an adult who went to college and worked and had a robust late-night social life. And so despite her worry, she told herself it was okay. Also, they had opposite schedules most of the time, so it was sort of normal to go a few days without seeing each other. Linda had not even tried calling her daughter until Friday, which was over 24 hours since the last time she saw her, and Misty didn't pick up. Then, Linda said on Sunday she had heard that a body had been found. And when she said that out loud, Linda sort of trailed off, unable to continue. Harold just sat there quietly as Linda tried to gather herself. He felt certain that her grief was very real, and he would love nothing more than just to leave her alone. But it was also critical that he get as much information about his victim from her as possible. So, once Linda seemed to be a little bit more composed, Harold asked her if there was anything else she could think of. Linda frowned, and for a moment she was quiet, but then she said, yes, actually there was. After Misty said goodbye to her that night, Linda said she fell back asleep. But then very shortly after she fell asleep, she woke up again to the sound of Misty's cell phone ringing in the other room. And then shortly after that, she heard the phone ring for a second time. So clearly her daughter had gotten 2 calls before she went out. Linda said she couldn't hear what was said or who the caller was on either of these calls, but it seemed like whoever was calling her was going to be the one giving Misty a ride. Harold wrote this down, and then, with Linda's permission, he took a look at Misty's bedroom. He didn't see anything significant, but he did take note of the fact that Misty's driver's license and her phone were not in there. Those 2 items had not been found with her body, so it was possible that her killer had them or had tossed them. Before he left, Harold got the name of the bar that Misty said she had been going to that night, as well as the name of some of her friends who were going to be there. Harold wanted to see if Misty had ever actually arrived. Later that night, Harold headed back into his office and sat down at his desk. The whole day had been nonstop, and he was exhausted. Harold and his team had spent hours locating and interviewing Misty's friends, and they all said that Misty never showed up to meet them at the bar, and that no one had talked to her since. This meant that whoever called Misty before she left home, in particular the second phone call, where apparently Linda thought she overheard that person signaling they were coming to pick Misty up, well, that possibly was the last person Misty spoke to. And if Misty's mom was right that that person had come to pick Misty up, well, they might very well be the killer. So Harold had pulled Misty's phone records, and they did indeed show that Misty had received 2 phone calls roughly around the time that Linda believed she heard the sound of 2 phone calls. However, in the year 2000, when this took place, phone records did not include the name or number of the caller. So the only thing Harold could see was what time the calls were made and how long they lasted, not who made them. He could see that Misty got one call at 1:58 a.m. that was very quick, and then she got another quick call at 2:23 a.m. And then after that, her phone was not used again. Even without a name or number of the caller or callers, this record was huge. And so even though Harold didn't know for sure if these 2 calls were made by the same person, given the fact that Linda said she overheard her daughter clearly making some sort of plan about getting picked up when she took these phone calls, it seemed likely that both of these calls were made by the same person who was coming to pick Misty up. And if that's true, well, we know Misty didn't arrive at the bar, and so very likely this caller was her ride, and her ride was her killer. None of Misty's family or friends said they were the ones who called Misty or picked her up that night. However, Harold was told that Misty was dating at least 2 different guys, and maybe one of them had given her a ride. Harold had these guys' names, and some officers were already doing some background checks on them. Just then, Harold's phone rang. And when he picked it up, he was very excited to hear it was the Coast Guard. And they had gotten a chance to look at that red and white rope that was used to tie Misty's hands, and they told Harold it looked like the kind that was used on sailboats. And they said the knot that was tied in it was very distinct. It was called a cow hitch knot, and it was taught in the Navy. Harold leaned back and smiled, because he could now add another detail to the profile he was building. He was looking for a suspect that had access to a boat and connections to the Navy or military. So Harold quickly thanked the Coast Guard and hung up, and then went to go update his officers on the call. And when he did this, one of them said something that sent Harold's heart racing. The backgrounds on the guys Misty was dating had come back, and one of them, Teddy Underwood, was a convicted felon with a history of sexual battery. And before Harold could even respond, the officer added that they had already picked Teddy up, and right now he was waiting for Harold in a nearby interrogation room. A few minutes later, Harold walked into that interrogation room and sat down across a table from Teddy. Now, based on Teddy's criminal history, Harold expected him to be hostile or maybe defensive, which would have prevented Harold from getting good information from him. So Harold had planned to start with very friendly, non-aggressive questions and just hoped that Teddy got relaxed enough to maybe let something slip. But Teddy was not what Harold expected at all. He was polite, cooperative, and seemed genuinely stunned to hear that Misty was dead. And when Harold asked about a Navy connection and a boat, Teddy said no to both. He also had an alibi. He said he was with some friends early in the morning of the 20th, and then he gave Harold their information to confirm it. Then Teddy leaned forward and told Harold he knew that he very likely looked guilty here because of his criminal history. But he said he did not kill Misty, and he would do whatever Harold needed to help solve this thing, including giving police a DNA sample. Harold was sort of shocked, because he just hadn't expected this level of cooperation. But Harold said yes immediately to Teddy's offer. Now, the crime scene techs had not found any forensics on Misty's body, and the rope and the tape were still being examined, but Harold still had hope, and he wasn't going to miss a chance to get a swab from one of his best suspects. Plus, Harold knew it was possible that Teddy was pretending to be cooperative as a manipulation tactic. In the year 2000, DNA testing technology was not nearly as advanced or as fast as it is today, and so Teddy could be banking on the water having washed away any testable evidence. But regardless, Harold jumped up and said that a detective and a forensics tech would be in shortly, and then Harold headed back to his desk. And when he got there, he called the phone numbers of the people that Teddy had given him to confirm his alibi, and when he called them, each one confirmed the alibi, which meant Teddy could be accounted for during the time Misty was likely killed. However, an alibi and a DNA sample were still actually not enough to completely eliminate Teddy, especially since Misty's time of death was just a theory. But Harold knew for now he would need to move on to other suspects. Just then, a uniformed police officer appeared at Harold's desk with a message from the medical examiner's office. They had found a few short hairs on the white duct tape from Misty's body. And this really intrigued Harold, because Misty had long hair. And hair on a body that did not belong to the victim usually belonged to the killer. But the Brevard County Sheriff's Department did not have the capacity to do that level of advanced DNA analysis. which meant that the last phone call Harold made for the evening was to the FBI labs in Quantico, Virginia. This was where most local police sent DNA for testing. Unfortunately, though, those kinds of tests took a long time. So as Harold arranged with the FBI to send the hairs from the duct tape along with Teddy's DNA down to Quantico, he knew he would not get any answers for at least a few months. On July 25th, so 2 days after Misty Morse's body was found in the river, Detective Gary Harrell parked his cruiser in front of a house that belonged to a man named Ricky Franklin. Ricky was the second man that Misty's family and friends said she was dating, and according to them, he and Misty had been on a few dates and spoke often. But Misty had also told people that she was not nearly as interested in Ricky as Ricky was in her. Harrell had his team do a background check on Ricky, and they hadn't seen anything suspicious in his history. But a one-sided attraction was definitely something that Harrell needed to look into. And now, sitting in his cruiser, Harrell saw something else that set off alarm bells. There was a boat in Ricky's front yard. Shortly after seeing this boat, Harrell had Ricky inside of a police interrogation room. Harrell had decided to do the interview at the station rather than at Ricky's house. That way Harrell could have more control over the conversation, which had apparently been a good idea, because Ricky was a mess. He was incredibly flustered and kept crying as he explained that he'd only heard yesterday that Misty was dead. Harrell knew he needed to calm Ricky down if he wanted this to go anywhere, so he told Ricky to take a breath and to just start with how he knew Misty. Ricky stammered as he said they met about 2 weeks ago and went on a date last Tuesday, the 18th, a day and a half before she was killed. They had some drinks with friends and then watched a movie together. They did have plans on Friday, and so he'd been calling her every day to confirm them and thought she was just kind of blowing him off when she wasn't answering. And then his voice broke as he said to the detective that even though he had just met Misty, he loved her. At the mention of these repeated phone calls that Ricky said he was making to Misty basically every day, Harrell sat up a bit straighter and then asked Ricky point blank if he had spoken to Misty on the phone in the early morning hours of July 20th, like after midnight. And Ricky said no. He said he called her the night before on the 19th at about maybe 7 or 7:30, and then also a few times throughout the day on the 20th, but he did not call her in the middle of that night. Harrell jotted this down. Now, Ricky could be lying, but even if he was telling the truth, it didn't mean he was innocent. It was sort of crazy that Ricky was already in love with Misty, and if Ricky felt rejected or angry she was seeing other people, well, then he had a motive. And also, the fact that he called her multiple times after she was already likely dead could have been an intentional ruse to make himself seem innocent. However, a hunch, along with there just being a boat parked in the front of his house, was not enough for an arrest here. Also, Ricky did not have a Navy background, or at least said he didn't, and he said he was home with his family during the time Misty was likely killed, and he quickly volunteered that, Harrell could talk to his entire family, and they would all confirm that he really was home. And so likely his alibi was actually legit. And so feeling disappointed, Harrell told Ricky he could go and he would be in touch. And then right as Ricky was about to leave, he stopped and told the detective that he almost forgot something. He said he had something of Misty's that the police likely wanted. And then Ricky pulled out his wallet. From it, he pulled out Misty's driver's license and gave it to Harrell. Harrell just stared at the license in shock. This license, along with Misty's phone, had not been found on her body, and they were missing from Misty's room, and so Harrell had assumed her killer must have them. And now here was Ricky offering up a murder victim's property like it was nothing. Ricky must have sensed the new tension in the room, because he quickly explained that when they went on a date last Tuesday, 2 days before her murder, Misty didn't have any pockets and didn't want to carry her license around. And so she'd asked Ricky to hold on to it, and he just forgot to give it back. Harrell nodded, but now his mind was racing. Suddenly, this whole interview felt like Ricky was just trying to get ahead of any evidence that connected him to the murder. And so that's when Harrell decided to take a risk, and he asked Ricky if they could go take a look around his property. And to his surprise, Ricky agreed. The next day, 3 days after Misty was found in the river, Harrell walked up yet another walkway to knock on yet another door. They had searched Ricky's house and boat and had not found any of what they were looking for. No red and white rope or white duct tape or really anything that could be connected to the crime. And also, Ricky's father had confirmed that Ricky really was home during the time Misty was likely picked up and killed. However, during this property search, Ricky had actually offered up another suspect, Misty's ex-boyfriend, Brent. According to Ricky, Brent had been abusive while he was dating Misty. Now, at first, Harold thought Ricky was just trying to point the finger at somebody else, so he had followed up with Misty's mom, Linda. But Linda had confirmed it. Misty's ex, Brent Huck, had been very possessive, and their relationship had been really rough, and it ended about a year ago. Following his discussion with Linda, Harold had some of his officers do a background check on Brent, and he was stunned at what came up. Brent had gone through naval training, but he was kicked out for not passing a swim test. Now, Brent worked as a private charter boat captain, and he owned multiple boats. And Brent's house was even on the Indian River, right near where Misty's body was found. And so Brent literally had all the criteria Harold was looking for in a suspect. And so once Harold reached the front door, he knocked, and right away he heard a dog barking inside, then footsteps coming towards him. A man opened up with a large, very friendly-looking dog panting right behind him, and the man asked Harold what he wanted. A few minutes later, Harold was inside the house, sitting in the living room with Brent Huck and his dog Chiba, who kept nuzzling Harold's knee. Brent was explaining that the reason he had this dog was actually because of Misty. She had bought Chiba when they lived together, but her new place had a no pets policy, so Chiba stayed with Brent when they split up. As Brent spoke, Harold noticed how calm he was, which could either be the demeanor of an actually innocent person or of somebody trying to seem innocent. Harold wasn't sure yet, so he asked Brent to tell him more about Misty and their relationship. Brent said they broke up a year ago, but he still cared about her, and actually they'd still been seeing each other on and off. He said the last time they slept together was July 11th, 9 days before she was killed. But they were keeping their relationship a secret since Brent had a serious girlfriend. Harold was amazed Brent was being so candid here. If what he was saying was true, then he definitely had a motive for killing Misty, like if he was worried that his current girlfriend would find out about them. So Harold pressed harder, and he asked Brent whether he saw Misty early in the morning on the 20th or whether he picked her up. But Brent said no. He said he had been at a bar and then partied with his friends before a girl dropped him off at his parents' house around 4 a.m. Brent was cooperative and answered every question that Harold threw at him. And so finally, Harold told Brent they would want to talk to him again, but at the station, and he would be in touch. As Harold left the house, he couldn't shake this feeling that Brent had to be their guy. Now, he was not acting guilty, and possibly he did have an alibi. But the details of his life, the Navy background and the boats, and his ongoing secret sexual relationship with Misty made him a perfect match for the suspect Harold had been looking for. However, this was also the third time that Harold had been certain he had found his killer. And in the other two instances, he had found some fact that made his theory impossible. And so he knew he was going to need something much stronger than just a profile based on circumstantial evidence if he wanted to connect any of his possible suspects to Misty's murder. For the next 2 months, Harold obsessed over this case. He thought about it at work. He thought about it at home. He thought about it when he laid in bed at night. He just went over and over the details again and again, including his suspects. Harold had confirmed Brent's alibi with the girl who had given him a ride, which meant that at the time Misty was receiving phone calls from her killer very likely and then also being murdered, Brent was out with friends. But he did have a few boats and a Navy connection, and he was also involved in a love triangle with Misty, which gave him a motive. Teddy Underwood, who had been seeing Misty casually, was a felon with a history of violence, but he willingly gave up his DNA, which could mean he had nothing to hide, or it could mean he was confident that the river would have washed away any evidence. And it might have, since Harold still had not received those DNA results back yet. Then there was Ricky Franklin, who was falling in love with Misty even though she didn't really care about him, but she seemed to know, which might have given him a motive. He also had a boat, and he had her license in his possession. But they also had not found anything incriminating when they searched his property. And so all of these men knew Misty well and were romantically involved with her. She certainly would have trusted each of them enough to let them pick her up, but they all had alibis. However, the time frame Misty died in was just an estimate, so Harold could not fully eliminate anyone just because of that. So Harold agonized over his list until September when his phone rang. When he picked up, a lab tech from the FBI was on the other end. They said they had finished looking over the hair samples Harold had sent over, as well as the swab from Teddy Underwood. And what they discovered was Teddy was not a match for this hair. But when Harold heard what the tech said next, he felt almost dizzy. because the tech was absolutely certain, even without conducting additional DNA testing on Ricky or Brent, that the hair found on that duct tape on Misty's body was not going to match any of Harold's suspects. However, this actually was a good thing, because it told Harold everything he needed to know. Based on the police investigation and forensic evidence, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to Misty Morse in the early morning hours of July 20th, 2000. At 1:58 a.m. on July 20th, the killer sat at their home with their phone pressed to their ear, listening to it ring. When Misty picked up, the killer told her they wanted to talk. Misty told them she already had plans, but the killer said they really wanted to see her. And when Misty said yes, the killer said they'd be right over. Then they hung up, jumped in their car, and started driving. And as they drove, the killer gripped the wheel tightly, angrily. They had just lied to Misty. They didn't want to talk to her. They wanted to hurt her, because Misty had ruined their life. And tonight, they were going to finally show her how angry she had made them. They got to Misty's apartment at 2:23 a.m., at which point they called her to say they were there. Minutes later, the killer saw Misty come outside and began walking towards them. And when Misty opened up the car door and climbed inside, the killer pretended like everything was just fine and told Misty if it was okay with her, they were going to drive back to their place and they could talk there. Misty said, sure. And so the killer casually turned the car around and headed down the road. Once the killer finally arrived back at their house and parked, the two of them climbed out, went inside, at which point the killer told Misty to make herself comfortable. And then the killer left and went into the other room and grabbed a few things they knew they would need for what they were about to do, which was rope and duct tape. Then the killer returned to where Misty was, and she was sitting with her back to them. And so as quietly as they could, the killer snuck up right behind her, and before she could scream, they reached out in front of her with the duct tape and pulled it tight over her mouth. Misty began to struggle, but she was so confused and shocked by what was happening, the killer was easily able to get rope around her hands as well and tie it in a knot. Misty looked at the killer, both pleading and confused, like, what's happening? And the killer couldn't stand to have her watching them, because it made them ashamed and even angrier. So they put more duct tape on her face, this time on her eyes. The killer could clearly hear her struggling to get loose and struggling to breathe, but they ignored her, and instead took off all her clothing and then gathered up the other supplies they would need: plastic grocery bags, rocks, and some more rope. The killer then carried the struggling Misty outside out to the water and put her onto a boat. They hopped on after her, untied the mooring, then floated out to the middle of the Indian River. And then, once they were out in the deepest part of the river, the killer casually tied bags of rocks around Misty's ankles and dumped her overboard. Misty immediately sunk below the surface and vanished. The killer waited for a long time, but Misty never came back up. So they eventually steered their boat back to shore, then headed inside their home and went to sleep, with their beloved dog curled up at their feet. It would turn out the hair that Harold had sent to the FBI lab was not human hair. It was dog hair. And investigators eventually matched it to Misty's beloved dog, Chiba, who now was living with Brent Huck. The night Misty died, Brent really was at a bar. But while he was there, he heard a rumor from his friends that Misty was apparently pregnant. Now, it was not true, she was not pregnant, but for a moment, Brent panicked that it was true, and that maybe the child was his. And even worse, his current girlfriend, who he was serious about and wanted to marry, she might find out and leave him. So even though he actually did have a friend, that girl, drive him home that night, it was way earlier than he or that friend had initially claimed, giving him plenty of time to pick up and then kill Misty. But unfortunately for Brent, the tape that he used to bind Misty had, of course, those hairs from Chiba on it. Brent was ultimately convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and was given 2 life sentences. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.